tackle at the Institute, especially in my case. So tonight I want to go over the 6-week readings, which are as much as we can, pages 139.
War between the man and the woman.
Oh, okay. You have the video on with the
There is
Leonard
a
Cohen.
war.
Yeah.
No,
That's the theme song of the program for prosperity, Marxism, Leonard Cohen. There is a war. Yeah. Anyway, okay. So the idea here again is to look at this. This is the section. The next 2, maybe even 3 weeks we should spend on this section, which is a libidinalization of Marx, if you will, at one level. If we can read libidinal economy into this. And of course, a very interesting way of a drive towards universal history, their attempt to build a universal history, and which I would think is predicated on the notion of revolutionary innocence or a radical innocence, a rerouting of innocence, and also a revolutionary, innocence that they seem to get to. Right. And anyway, so I'd like to, tonight to focus on this inscribing, inscribing socius and the notion of inscription and what they're doing in this first section. And then we can go on to other parts. I want to back up just for a second too to talk just briefly about something we didn't, I just want to read it. We didn't really fully cover the psychic and social repression that Deleuze and Guattari are mentioning vis-a-vis Reich. So I want to turn first, and I think all the people that are really involved are here now. So if you go to page 118 and 119 in this section, this is in the section still in holy familialism and social repression and psycho repression. So this is part 7 of section 7 of part 2 on holy familialism, and it's literally. And this is a very important chapter, I think, section, 113 to 115, about 5 pages in, and the paragraph begins, at least in my edition, the strength of Reich. Okay, the strength of Reich, and I've read this before, but I want us to kind of see what they're up to vis-a-vis both Reich, Marcuse, and other thinkers of a kind of radical Freud. The strength of Reich consists in having shown how psychic repression depended on social repression, which in no way implies a confusion of the two concepts, since social repression needs psychic repression precisely in order to form docile subjects and to ensure the reproduction of the social formation, including its repressive structures. But social repression should not be understood by using as a starting point a familial repression coextensive with civilization. And I think this leads into, this third part that we're going to be dealing with tonight. Far from it. It is civilization that must be understood in terms of a social repression inherent to a given form of social production. Social repression bears on desire and not solely on needs or interests. Okay, so this is really getting out of the traditional Anglo-American philosophy and many, many readings of people about self-interest and the notion and the problem of interest culture. For them, it is based on desire. Again, we don't really speak that way, honestly, in the American or the Anglo-American tradition of philosophy. Only by means, right, of sexual repression. The family is indeed the delegated agent of this psychic repression insofar as it ensures a mass psychological reproduction of the economic system of a society. Of course, it should not be concluded from this that desire is Oedipal. On the contrary, it is the social repression of desire or sexual repression, that is the stasis of libidinal energy that actualizes Oedipus and engages desire in this requisite impasse organized by the repressive society. Reich was the first to raise the problem of the relationship between desire and the social field, and went further than Marcuse, who treats the problem lightly. Okay, we're talking about 1933, 32, 33, 34 versus 55. Marcuse is 20 years later, a whole generation later, with Eros and Civilization. He is the true founder of a materialist psychiatry. Okay? The true founder. Situating the problems in terms of desire, he is the first to reject the explanations of a summary Marxism, too quick to say the masses were fooled, mystified. And we went over this a little bit last week, and very important point. But since he had not sufficiently formulated the concept of desiring production, he did not succeed in determining the insertion of desire into the economic infrastructure itself. And hence, this is why the language of, I think, territorialization and re-territorialization and deterritorialization. The insertion of the drives into social production. Consequently, revolutionary investment seemed to him such that the desire moving within it simply coincided with the economic rationality. This is also, in my opinion, part of the mistake of the Frankfurt School. We can go there if you want to, but this is a mistake I think that Adorno and others made too in their work, or at least some members of the Frankfurt School, maybe not so much Adorno. As to the reactionary mass investments, they seem to him to derive from ideology, so that psychoanalysis merely had the role of explaining the subjective, the negative, and the inhibited, without participating directly as psychoanalysis in the positivity of the revolutionary movement or in the desiring-creativity. To a certain extent, didn't this amount to a reintroduction of the error or the illusion? The fact remains that Reich, in the name of desire, caused the song of life to pass into psychoanalysis. He denounced, in the final resignation of Freudianism, a fear of life, a resurgence of the aesthetic ideal. I know I read this before, but I think it's very important for our purposes. A cultural broth of bad consciousness. Yeah, and you can hear the Nietzschean moment here. I mean, I have next to me the genealogy of morals, just in case, since we're going to be talking a little bit about mnemotechne and cruelty. Better to depart in the search of the organ, which is what obviously Reich does, right, than to continue being a psychoanalyst under those conditions. No one forgave him this, whereas Freud got full pardon. Reich was the first to attempt to make the analytic machine and the revolutionary machine function together. In the end, he had only his own desiring machines, his paranoid, miraculous, and celibate boxes with metallic inner walls lined with cotton and wool. Yeah, I mean, I knew someone at the graduate center years ago who actually went to the organ, to the box. And I know a lot of people that, were really seeking this out for a while. Anyway, psychic repression, and I'm sorry to read all this, but I think it's very important as we go into the inscribing socius tonight. Psychic repression distinguishes itself from social repression by the unconscious nature of the operation and by its result. Even the inhibition of revolt has become unconscious, a distinction that expresses clearly the difference in nature between the two repressions. But a real independence cannot be concluded from this. Psychic repression is such that social repression becomes desired. It induces a consequent desire, a faked image of its object on which it bestows the appearance of independence. Strictly speaking, psychic repression is a means in the service of social repression. What it bears on is also the object of social repression, desiring production. But it, in fact, implies an original double operation. The repressive social formation delegates its power to an agent of psychic repression, and correlatively, the repressed desire is as though masked by the faked, displaced image to which the repression gives rise. Psychic repression is delegated by the social formation, while the desiring formation is disfigured and displaced by psychic repression. The family is the delegated agent of psychic repression, or rather the agent delegated to psychic repression. The incestuous drives, and they're going to go through this many, many times in this next section about the incest prohibition and what incest really meant to the quote, the wild. I don't like this title savage for sauvage. Sauvage in French, I looked it up. It's not savage. It's a very bad translation. Wildness, the wild thing, wild person, et cetera. The wild child, enfant sauvage, the film, that was done by Truffaut, et cetera. But anyway, we'll be there in a second. Okay, the Oedipus complex, the process of Oedipalization, is therefore the result of this double operation. And remember again, this is a retroactive work in a sense. How did we get here? How did we get to Oedipus as terminus, in capital, right? It is in one and the same movement, and this is important, and the reason for the italicization, that the repressive social production is replaced by the repressing family, and that the latter offers a displaced image of desiring production that represents the repressed as incestuous familial desires. In this way, the family drives relationship is substituted for relationships between the two orders of production, in a diversion where the whole of psychoanalysis goes astray. And the interest of such an operation from the point of view of social production becomes evident, for the latter could not otherwise ward off desire's potential for revolt and revolution. I think this is again crucial in terms of the creation of docility, servitude, and a technique that is being used by this outside system that they're speaking to. By placing the distorting mirror of incest before desire, that's what you wanted, isn't it? Desire is shamed, stupefied. It is placed in a situation without exit. It is easily persuaded to deny itself in the name of the more important interests of civilization. What if everyone did the same? What if everyone married his mother or kept his sister for himself? There would no longer be any differentiation, any exchanges possible. We must act quickly and soon. Incest, a slandered, shallow stream. Although we can see, again, social production's interest in such an operation, it is less clear which makes this operation possible from the point of view of desiring production itself. We do have, however, the elements of a response, and this is interesting. Social production, when needed at its disposal on the recording surface of the socius, an agent that is also capable of acting on, of inscribing the recording surface of desire. Such an agent exists, that is the family. It belongs essentially to the recording of social production as a system of reproduction of the producers. And doubtless, at the other pole, the recording of desiring production on the body without organs is brought about through a genealogical network that is not familial. Parents only intervene here as partial objects, flows, signs, and agents of a process that outflanks them on all sides. At most, the child innocently relates, quote unquote, to his parents some part of the astonishing productive experience he is undergoing with his desire, but this experience is not related to them as such. Yet this is precisely when the operation arises. Under the preconscious action of social repression, the family sips into and interferes with the network of desiring genealogy. It assumes the task of alienating the entire genealogy. It confiscates the Newman, but see here, God is daddy. The desiring experience is treated as if it were intrinsically related to the parents and as if the family were its supreme law. Partial objects are subjected to the notorious law of the totality, unity acting as lacking. Again, they return to that. The disjunctions are subjected to the alternative of the undifferentiated or exclusion. The family is therefore introduced in the production of desire and will perform a displacement, an unparalleled repression of desire commencing with the earliest age of the child. Social production delegates the family to psychic repression. And if the family is able in this manner to slip into the recording of desire, it is because the body without organs on which this recording is accomplished already exists or exercises, on its own account, as we have seen, a primal repression of desiring production. It falls to the family to profit from this and to superimpose the repression that is properly termed secondary, this being a function delegated to the family or one to which the family is delegated. Psychoanalysis has clearly demonstrated the difference between these two repressions, but has not shown the scope of this difference to the distinction between their respective regimes. That is why psychic repression, in the strict sense, does not content itself with repressing real desiring production, but offers a displaced apparent image of the repressed by substituting a familiar recording for the recording of desire. Desiring production, taken as a whole, does not assume the well-known edible figure except in the familiar translation of its recording, translation and betrayal. And then they go on to talk about Oedipus more, and of course they end with this quote from Antoine Artaud, about the child, an angle, something to come, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, someone's trying to get in. Okay, so first of all, I'll throw this back to you. I think this is a very important part of a transition, if you will, to the next section, for tonight, which is going to be on, the inscribing socius and the beginning of, if you will, the quote, wildness, barbarians, and civilized, and civilization. I looked at the French, it's civilization, it's not civilized men either. So sauvage, barbare, and civilization. So anyway, any comments about this? And of course, look, Reich has been, certainly written out of psychoanalytic history in a lot of ways. My problem personally, I'll express this with Reich, is that there was never really an emphasis on language alongside the body. In some ways, it was the body language, the character armor, and the character analysis, and somehow did not see, the primacy of language and psychoanalytic, practice, and et cetera. So, yeah, I'd like to hear from you first. I think this is a very good starting point, this notion of psychic and social repression, and again, how this works in terms of taking a work of literature, translating it into a complex, into something everything is read off of, again, the Oedipal, conflicts, Oedipal, moments, right? How this occurs, this is a result, according to Deleuze and Guattari, of capitalism, and this could not happen anywhere else but under capitalism. So this is another absolute thing that we have to think about, because we're going to deal when we get to the next chapter with telos and beginning again. So yeah, so I'd like to hear, anybody, about this passage. I know that the reading was different, but this is from last week, but I think it's crucial. Yeah. No.
Well, one of the things I'll just jump in that,
yeah, sure, please.
That strikes me is that, and this, it's interesting as we progress through the reading, how they actually understand what sort of constitutes or organizes or generates all these operations. So particularly the function they assign to the social, which I sort of I link to, the disjunctive synthesis, the coding, the sort of the organization of the decentered flows, right? That they're and it's interesting how I just, when you were reading this, it really stood out to me that on one page they were sort of talking about needs and interests and trying to move away from that, but then they say on page 120 that social production's interest, and then social production would need. So they kind of reassign the idea of interest and need to social reproduction. And I don't think that that's necessarily a problem, but to me, it's interesting how they will come to understand how the mechanism operates, because it's almost like they're ascribing a certain agency to social production, the coding, but it's not clear how or who or what is doing that coding. Does this make sense? So it's like the family is being assigned this function. The family then intervenes in desiring production, which I get that they sort of, are trying to understand in terms of the production of partial objects in these syntheses, and then begins to cut and reorganize and restructure that desire in terms of the familial recording, right? But it's not. It seems almost like a structural functionalism to me.
Yeah.
In sociology.
Yeah, please, Beryl. Yeah. Okay, please, Carl, continue. I'm sorry to cut you off.
Just that. Like as we go further, that it seems like there's kind of a structural functionalist element.
Okay.
That's ultimately kind of where, but I
love this use of American sociological terminology coming in, but it's okay. I mean, I understand.
No, but like in some ways, there's this is a longer but there's other strand like the Althusserian, and then how that translated into political economy, which is sort of my field. Right. And a lot of this, there's also a very strong Durkheimian influence in this, which is often, I think, not being recognized, and maybe it's just sort of seeped into their thinking. But while structural functionalism is it's associated with Parsons,
yes,
the idea is more general.
Mm-hmm.
That explanation occurs when you can explain how the system reproduces itself.
Okay.
You don't really.
I'm going to let Beryl take it up here, please. Yeah, Beryl, please. Yeah, good.
Yeah, it's interesting because my comment actually does relate to Carl's. I mean, what resonated for me through passage is the Althusserian notion of the family as a part of the ideological state apparatus. And I agree with Carl that there's a strong Durkheimian element, which I think goes across all of French theory. It's part of their taken for granted. It's the air they breathe. Yes. And that idea of the social as being an external and given that inscribes into the family. I think there's strong parallels with Althusser here.
Yeah, I mean, everybody is familiar with Althusser, as I'm sure, the ideological state apparatus, the first being the family, the church, and the educational, in a way. And he juxtaposes this, or tries to articulate it next to what he calls the RSAs, the actual repressive state apparatuses, which are the police and the state itself at work, in a way. So it's interesting, how this actually works in Althusser. And of course, this gave birth to Screen Magazine and a lot of, attempts to synthesize, Lacan and Althusser. But yeah, some other thinking about this. I mean, I hear the Durkheim. I mean, obviously very crucial for French thought. I agree. I mean, his presence is still felt today. They don't mention him once, by the way, in the text. Yeah. And the best of my knowledge, I've read a lot of Deleuze, and I've read more and more of Guattari lately. There's no mention of Emile Durkheim. There is mention of his nephew, Marcel Mauss. The gift is a form of exchange, which is important, who also wrote a general history of magic, which is interesting too, around ideology and fetish. Yeah. So, but some other, this is an interesting, take on this, that the Althusserian Marxist structuralism, if you will, kind of it plays into, which you were mentioning earlier, structural functionalism. But please.
Whether the notion of interpolation
yes.
can be seen as somehow synonymous with inscription. I'm not sure.
No, this is interesting that you can make a leap here. I mean, I like the way you're doing this. this is the making of a very good, essay, how interpolation moves into the inscribing socius. And interpolation also was very important to Derridian, deconstruction. And interpolation basically, historically, was done by Tertullian. He was the first to think through interpolation, in terms of the hey, you over there, turn around, right, etc., which was the moment. So this is very good, to the inscribing socius. I guess one of the tasks would be to take the socius and talk about how it may be different than the social and the social fact in Durkheim. This could be a kind of interesting, attempt to look at this in a different way. So some other folks. Eloy, please. Eloy's going to bring us down to earth now. Okay.
No, not at all. Not at all. No. I have more doubts than anything. One of that is, for me, was I think that passage that you mentioned, and that is kind of becomes clear in the next chapter, is that I think there is a parallel, there is a strong connection with Foucault. And one of the critiques of Foucault in the history of sexuality towards Reich and Marcuse, he didn't mention Marcuse, but he was speaking about Reich a lot, is the idea that Freudian Marxists used to think that desire, that eros, it was something kind of consubstantial, natural to human beings, and that the power of institutions, what they do is to repress desire.
Right.
And Foucault in the history of sexuality says, no, power actually produces desire. It is a productive machine. He doesn't speak about machine, but it's a productive force. It's a very Nietzschean idea, right?
Yes.
And so what happens is that the institutions structure our desires. It gives them a direction, a particular direction, and not others, right? And so I thought that passage that you mentioned, it is a critique or a critical stand to the idea that the desire is repressed, and instead they, as Foucault said, that desire is produced, is structured. And they are very structuralist. I agree totally. Marcel Mauss and Durkheim is very clear there. Lévi-Strauss, very French, I would say, from the 70s. But I say it's just more doubts than certainties.
Eloy, don't you see them though as sort of reasserting the notion of repression, which I agree, in History of Sexuality, it seems like Foucault is trying to kind of get away from that whole framework.
Just the concept, he says.
Right, but that
who dreamt up this, like sublimation, which
I mean, it's been a long time since I read that, but that's what I remember, is exactly what Eloy said, that it doesn't repress, it constitutes desire. And it seems that they're trying to find a different path. They are talking about repression, but then they're also trying to, I think, get a more complex understanding of the relation between social operations and desire.
Yeah, very interesting. And the chapter, at the beginning of the next chapter, it's that there is a paragraph, the third one, that says capitalism only unleashes desire, and at the same time, it put its limits to it, because desire can be very ungovernable force, right? And so it creates a double movement, which is structured and it's kind of a repressed in some ways, but at the same time, it operates upon our unleashed desires, right? It's kind of a contradictory move. And that's what I got, but it's more complex than I understand, but I'm just trying.
Interesting. We're going to hold that. That's good. Moving in. Any other, anybody else on this psychic and social repression? Again, I think we need to think the socius as a little bit distinct from Durkheimian social in a way. I mean, I think this is important too, because the socius, the difference here is that, in a way, these guys are monsters, right? Durkheim was an academic. These guys are thinking about inscribing the body, right? How the body really, in a way, is the tattooed wildness, et cetera. The inscribing socius is really the important part here. How we are written, yeah, how we are being written, how we become territorialized, how the re-territorialization happens, and really the whole thing of capitalism and schizophrenia, the subtitle, which is probably better to invert. This is a book about capitalism and schizophrenia, then it's Anti-Oedipus, because the Anti-Oedipus is the terminal point, the Oedipal, structure is the terminal point of where capitalism is gone. And you'll see this later, the phrases of the imperial Freud, et cetera. The relationships they see between Adam Smith and Freud in terms of the economy. Freud was very fond of Hayek. It's interesting, the neoconservative, economist. He had very good things to say about Hayek. He never really read any Marxist political economy, but Hayek, he had, some relationship too. So it's kind of interesting in that regard as well. Yeah. So but anybody else before we get into the the socius and the inscribing socius? Yeah.
Well,
I think this is, please, yeah.
I back on page 10. I mean, the way I interpret the socius is it's almost the surface on which the inscription takes place.
Yes, absolutely.
And that I think more the structural function, the operations are more the inscribing processes, right? Those mechanisms, those operations that inscribe. So I do believe that, yes, it's a very different concept than Durkheim and Marx, for instance, or most sociology. I would agree with that.
Right. So, and since you went back there, at least in my book on page 10, is also capital is indeed the body without organs of the capitalist, or rather of the capitalist being. So we can kind of also presuppose that or retain that as we go forward, and the body without organs and the miraculization that takes place, right? And also the relationship of the either or is being broken down, all the binaries as we go forward. And the schizoid is always thinking, and then, right? And then the conjunctive synthesis, right, is always operative. Not only the connected, and certainly the disjunctive being part of this double bind that we constantly find ourselves in, and we speak about it constantly in this so-called webinar or whatever. And but anyway, the conjunctive synthesis, the and then as a movement to the schizoid. Okay, so maybe we can go to the inscribing socius. I'm sorry to read out loud tonight, but I'd like to establish a kind of rhythm to this, and so far so good, I guess. And I'm going to read from the beginning because I want us to read that the desire, if you will, of Deleuze and Guattari here is to go to make a case for universal history. Yep, this is really the case here in the beginning, the inscribing, of socius, right? So if the universal comes at the end, and this is important, the universal comes at the end, the body without organs and desiring production under the conditions determined by an apparently victorious capitalism, and we can substitute for that triumphant capitalism of Fukuyama, 1992, the new PNAC, Project for a New American Century, the new economic world order, of course, now the Davos meetings, et cetera, et cetera. Where do we find enough innocence for generating universal history? Desiring production always also exists from the beginning. There's desiring production from the moment there is social production and reproduction. But in a very precise sense, it is true that pre-capitalist, and this is where they're going to go, pre-capitalist social machines are inherent in desire. And this is what most of this chapter will be about again, and I'll point to the syntheses operate. What we're doing in this first part is we're really looking at the connected synthesis, right? And I'll go over that a little bit, that the connected synthesis in terms of their three types are happening here, right? In a very precise, that are inherent in desire, they code it they code the flows of desire, right? Right? Pre-capitalist social machines, right, are inherent in desire. They code it. They code the flows of desire. To code desire and the fear, the anguish of decoded flows is the business of the socius. This is what the socius does. This is how it, to use Parsonian language, functions, right? How it orients us in a sense, right? As we shall see, capitalism is the only social machine, again, that is constructed on the basis of decoded flows, substituting for intrinsic codes an axiomatic of abstract quantities in the form of money. So capitalism works on axiomatic logic, right? This is one of their great insights here. The axiomatic is part of the capitalist, social machine. Capitalism therefore liberates the flows of desire, but under what Leroy was pointing out, the social conditions that define its limit. And this is always very important, to define its limit and the possibility of its own dissolution, so that it is constantly opposing with all its exasperated strength the movement that drives it towards the limit. At capitalism limit, the deterritorialized socius gives way to the body without organs. This is where the schizophrenic ends. This is it, the beginning of things. Why the neurotic and the psychotic, is not an example of, where we're going to take this at the end of, quote, or at the limit of capital. And the decoded flows throw themselves into desiring production. Hence, it is correct to retrospectively understand all history, and I like this. This is a very good way. This is very Nietzschean, by the way, in the light of capitalism, provided that the rules formulated by Marx are followed exactly. So again, we're going to be using the rules of political economy, so especially the political economy of the Grundrisse and the notion of the totality of the production, consumption and distribution and exchange value as articulated in the critique. Yeah, but interesting here, universal history is the history of contingencies and not the history of necessity. Very interesting, right? Ruptures and limits and not continuity, for great accidents were necessary and amazing encounters that could have happened elsewhere or before or might never have happened in order for the flows to escape coding and escaping to nonetheless fashion a new machine bearing the determinations of the capitalist socius. Thus, the encounter between private property, and this is very good, I think, and commodity production, which presents itself, however, as two quite distinct forms of decoding by privatization and by abstraction. Or from the viewpoint of private property itself, the encounter between flows of convertible wealth owned by capitalists and a flow of workers possessing nothing more than their labor capacity. Here again, two distinct forms of deterritorialization. In a sense, capitalism has haunted all forms of society, but it haunts them as their terrifying nightmare. It is the dread they feel of a flow that would elude their codes. There again, if we say that capitalism determines the conditions and the possibility of a universal history, this is true only insofar as capitalism has to deal essentially with its own limit, its own destruction, as Marx says, insofar as it is capable of self-criticism, at least to a certain point, the point where the limit appears in the very movement that counteracts the tendency. In a word, and this is interesting, I like this, universal history is not only retrospective, it is also contingent, for Bruno, singular, ironic, and critical, right? All of these things are working out, right? Very, very ways, right? Yeah. Free and open, contingent, chance, etc. Number one. Two, singular, in terms of its singularities, its moments that goes beyond that of, individuation, the processes of individuation, ironic, and critical. All of these things are happening all at once, right, in this new history. So this is where they begin, this section on the wild, right, the barbarians, and civilization. And these are the three areas of which they're going to, epochs, if you will, of history. And the first epoch, again, is this originary, if you will, sauvage, right, that they're going to describe. So this is where, again, I'd like to focus on tonight, the territorial machine, the repression, etc. This has a lot to do with the beginning of memory and debt and guilt. I think this is a very important section, especially number one, to set the entire part three into motion. So maybe I'll ask some of you, what again do we see in part one that's very significant? For me, the moment of Nietzsche is absolutely crucial. Yeah, going forward. Yeah, Bruno.
Yeah, no, I mean, there is so much, of course, but one thing that I was thinking as I was reading this pages is that, well, one of the things you just read, it's very interesting, and maybe we can think of it, because we had the question earlier of what this body without organs really is. And so the question that they set the limits of a capital, which is capitalism, which is already a very interesting move, radical. I mean, if we think of those who traditionally had said, well, capital, and that's it, right? I mean, there is no limit and so on. So, and the limit is, right, you were reading, this is, I believe, line 3 from the top of page 140, right? Capitalism's limit, the deterritorialized socius gives way to the body without organs. So, capitalism is a formation, then we have the deterritorialized socius, and then also the body without organs, that, if I may, I don't know how appropriate this is, but here in other similar places, I thought of Heidegger's very interesting also distinction between the earth and the world, right? I mean, that kind of, right, which is, and since the next page, they cite Lewis Mumford in Mumford too, in his work on the city comes from the earth.
Right.
So there is this, and considering also that they are speaking beautifully about this universal, a recasting of universal history precisely in terms of contingencies. That's it made me think of this very interesting. I mean, it's not simply a twofold structure, that would be too simplistic, but there is this passage. And the contingencies themselves, if I may call attention again to, and I don't know if you read this when you were reading before, but page 137, the very end of the previous chapter, chapter 2, when they speak about the last line, the skids, they're speaking about the skids, and they say many local fires, patiently kindled for a generalized explosion. I find this very beautiful, by the way, but I was thinking that, so there is this movement that they are tracing, and this situation of, on the one hand, we have the body without organs, then we have, of course, and I may be mistaken, but we had the socius, and then all the various formations of social life. The distinction had been made before between the socius and social structures and so on. I mean, I don't know if this is any of any help.
I mean, socius is being presupposed always before social production and social reproduction. I mean, it's again why it's different than, if you will, than the Durkheimian notion. The socios is a kind of collective energy, if you will, that is, always already there, right, for them. This is what desiring production is coming from. The Oedipal, again, the narrative the complex, and all of these matters are all part of a fiction that becomes institutionalized and used by capitalism as a new form, even though both of social repression, and part of their critique, if you will, is that psychoanalysis has fallen prey, if you will, to participating in this by this emphasis upon, something that fit the capitalist daddy, mommy, me triangulation so well, right? This ideological apparatus, such as the family, once again, that Althusser was so good on. So I think this is where, again, Oedipus is not in feudal society as an operator, right? Right? This is, Oedipus comes into being, of course, by the rereading of the Greek classics, partially from the Renaissance, but certainly in German idealism. Yeah. And again, I want to point out that Freud's, his name was Bernays, his wife's brother wrote a prize-winning Goethe prize-winning essay on Antigone. So this was very much part of the culture. But what they're saying in this history that they want to build, and this retrieval, if you will, if you want to think of it as retrieval, or if you want to talk about it recapturing, or going way back to this radical innocence that is basically revolutionary and radical in its very desire. This is what I think they're up to, right? In a sense. Right?
Yeah, and so there
it's
is
like the
also
Heraclitean child at play in the universe. There's no judgment. There's no, you know what I mean. The universe is like a child at play. This is part of their contingency that they're working with. In a way, the pre-Socratics are very operative here, philosophically speaking. Yeah, I think, especially Heraclitus and Epicurus. Yeah. So, yeah. Go ahead, Bruno. Yeah, I'm sorry.
no, sorry, there is a lot of noise here. If it bothers you, they are doing things outside. It's okay.
Tell them to shut the what up, Yeah.
Okay.
Be repressive, right?
I close the window. Yeah. No. I mean, then we will see probably later. And that is a question actually that I was having earlier as I was reading when we get into the Urstadt, which is their invention basically, right, of a concept, and the question of, certainly there is throughout the book here destruction really of ideological forms and so on, and this remaking of universal history in according to what they say, it's a question of ruptures and discontinuities and so on. And then so we had this ideological Oedipus itself, but even incest, they say, doesn't exist, it cannot exist.
Privileged by the capitalists.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then the Urstadt itself is a kind of superimposition which doesn't happen through ruptures and discontinuities, but the other way around. So, it is actually, that's the sign of the falseness, in a sense, of that.
I just want to do something on the meta level just for a second. But since Bruno, we both are bringing up this kind of, writing of universal history, and he was reminded somewhat of Heidegger's distinction between earth and world. If you think of Heidegger's project in the history of philosophy, the destruction and the rewriting of ontology, what Heidegger is doing is very similar in philosophy with what they're trying to do to Freud, and to another degree, somewhat to Marx. And this is a very interesting parallel in my mind, of a parallelism that we, could work with, that Heidegger's task in some ways is to say, look, Plato and Aristotle, systematic Western philosophy has led to a kind of nihilism, right? From Plato to Nietzsche. This is where we are. It's at the end of philosophy. We've reached the limit of philosophy. And now we are positioned in terms of a task of thinking. This is where we are. And through this, he says, we can't avoid this. It's not like you're jumping off the analyst's couch or you're saying to hell with Freud or whatever. And as I pointed out, the anti also means in compensation for as well as in opposition. When you use a word like anti in Greek, right? And you think about what it really means. But anyway, the idea with Heidegger always was you have to systematically work through the history of metaphysics. You systematically have to go through this phenomenological destruction in order to come out to the other end, to see where the West lost its way, right? Where are the signposts? How can we think? What is the new horizon? And I think they're doing a very similar thing with both Marx and Freud. But in their case, they don't see Nietzsche as a nihilist. They see Nietzsche, something else, right? And in some ways, this is an interesting moment to me. Or their use of Nietzsche is very different than Heidegger's, even though Deleuze studied Heidegger's, 4 volumes on Nietzsche. So I just want to point that out. And Derridian deconstruction, I had the pleasure of working a little bit with Rainer Schurman before his untimely death at the New School. In some ways, Derrida's project is very similar in terms of the deconstruction of Western metaphysics, which of course Alan Bass presents very well in his translations and the writings on this, and as do many of the better Derridians. I find Derridian jargon too prevalent in academia. It became a jargon, just like Heideggerian language becomes almost cultish. But all to say, does Derrida, Derridian deconstruction, which is a term, by the way, that Marx uses first in history, Abbau, which means to unbuild, to deconstruct something. Marx uses this in the Grundrisse. Then Husserl uses it, then Heidegger in the basic problems of phenomenology, and then Derrida, it becomes household, academically household after the 70s, the middle to late 70s and to today, deconstruction. But this, again, the same thing is operating here in a way, the deconstruction, if you will, of these things that, only capitalism has made this possible, right? And to go back. And is the gain ultimately, and I'm not saying this is the object or the aim only, but is the gain ultimately to recapture, and I like this word, this notion that they have of the revolutionary innocence, right? In a way, that is, Deleuze once says about the superego, I have nothing to admit, right? I have no guilt, right? In some way, I'm sure he had plenty, but it's like I mentioned last week about Sartre. I had full possession of my mother at an early age, therefore I had a super ego, right? I became tremendously over responsible. But anyway, all to say, I think this is important to keep in mind that they're really looking for a way out, right? It's not so much just an attack, right? It's not just so much a critique. There's a working through that is really trying to get to the other side, and they'll come up. We'll see this as we go further. This schizoid analysis, this new form of looking at things. And by the way, Guattari never really gave up fully on psychoanalysis. I mean, I have some of his writings in French where psychoanalysis and schizoid analysis are working together in certain ways still, but with that critique in mind. Very much like, and I don't think they're foolish enough to think that they, let's just be done with it and throw it, out into the street. I think they want to work through it and they see the constant here. But I think this is very important, what you read, Bruno, and in a sense, this, the history of contingencies and not the history of necessity. It's very interesting, that they're going to talk about universality, or the universal as a history of contingency, of breakthroughs, what they're looking for, ruptures, discontinuities, all of these things that are very, very important. Yeah, please, Hugo. Yeah.
Sorry that I missed a couple of classes. I've been away, so I'm back.
You've noticed. Yeah. How you doing? Yeah.
So I don't exactly know where the conversation has been in the last, period, but something you just said a moment ago, I'm not sure, at least in my sense of this text and my reading of it, that what Deleuze and Guattari are doing is attempting to recapture or recuperate some lost innocence or some age of original sort of I don't
mean it in a nostalgic sense.
Kind of cognitive totality or something. I think I don't mean it. My reading of this sort of and sense of it is that it's really more, in a sense, not exactly evolutionary, but that there's a continuous movement through time, which at every point enables the possibility for a kind of authentic or sort of embodiment or desiring expression. That is in a way the part of the association of that moment and time. So I don't think, I mean, this text seems to me decidedly, and this whole, sort of line of thinking, anti-romantic, not romantic in any sense. And it's part of, and I think it's the discourse of the text underlies that in terms of the language of the machine, the notion of flows that are segmented, coded and decoded, right. The body which becomes abstracted and but not in that, not that because the body has had some kind of original purity to it, but rather that at every moment in time in sort of human existence, there is a capturing of energy and desire and flow in time of being, or sort of, and which is how I'm reading desiring production and desiring machines and just the whole language around machines. That's really, in a way, what makes me think just the use of the term machines, I think, remains complicated. But I would say this to me is not a text that is looking back, but is looking forward.
I certainly don't mean a revolutionary or radical innocence in the sense of a nostalgia or a romantic notion. If anything, these people are totally anti-romantic. They're out of the anti-romantic tradition. They want to push deterritorialization to the limit. Capitalism works on relative, deterritorialization, they will say, whereas, what the schizoid does, right? And the schiz is it goes to the point of an absolute deterritorialization. So this is where they want to push. They want to push capitalism. They don't want to resist capitalism. They want to push it to the limit. This is a very anti-romantic and anti-great refusal of Marcuse, too, in many ways. I mean, this is a very different kind of approach, and when I remarked earlier, this is very anti-Hegelian in some ways. There's no reconciliation. There's no attempt to retain, ultimately, and lift to higher planes. That's one aspect of the connective synthesis, right? That tries to get in terms of successive stages, but that's only at the connective level. That's certainly not at the disjunctive or at the conjunctive level. So this is very complicated, and I'm glad you brought that up. But I want to make it clear that this notion of revolutionary desire or revolutionary innocence and radical innocence is not going nostalgic or to a a more, quote, primitive state, if I could use that language, or originary state. This is not like Primal Scream. This is not like, these kind of, trendy moments. It's very different in a way,
Or some kind of prelapsarian idea.
Yeah, in some ways, yes, right.
I actually don't think, I think they're rejecting the whole construct of a sort of teleology of history where there was once a golden age from which collapsed or from which there was a fall, and that, the problem of desire has nothing to do with sin whatsoever. No. It has everything to do with embodiment. No. Yes, and exactly. and the sort of being in the body.
Right.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Bruno. Yeah, please.
No, what is I can find the word innocence of the expression radical innocence that you are.
That's me. I'm just.
Oh, that's you. Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's just me.
No, but that's very well. Yeah.
I mean,
what I wanted to
ground it a little bit. Yeah.
What I wanted to.
Their concept. I don't know if they have that concept.
No. It's okay.
The thing I like about innocence is it's outside, the standard,
No,
it's very
okay.
Heraclitean, it's very Taoist, as you know, it has a very different kind of.
No, very good. But in fact, sorry, Michael. No, I wanted to suggest that's a very good thing, actually, because, and in a sense, there is, as always, a very intimate link. But Nietzsche, speaks of atheism. He says atheism and the second innocence go together. I think that's in the third essay of, but it is in the context of the question of precisely death, the end of death, as also, and we know the relation guilt and sin. Therefore, so this he says that metaphorically in a sense, but not all. I mean, that's an interesting, maybe, no,
I mean,
notation to make. Yeah.
As David, Jane, and other people in the room know, I mean, Freud compared psychoanalysis, in terms of its institution, to that of the church or the army, right? In a way, it became an institution, right? It became the O and the ought, if you will, or the notion of obligation. Again, that guilt played out a lot in this, right? And there are many, many levels. And in some ways, Guattari, in terms of his own experience as a militant analyst and someone who, basically broke, he went to see Lacan. Lacan did not treat him so nicely, when after the analysis was over, he went with him with some proposals, and supposedly Lacan was very distant and cold. That may be part of it. Who knows? I mean, I don't like these anecdotes, but I know a lot of them. Of course, Lucien Sebag, who was a very good friend, by the way, of Guattari, the anthropologist, and I recommend his book, Marxism and Structuralism, a major, major thinker who's not read in the United States at all. He committed suicide. He was in love with Lacan's daughter, Judith, and there was a real problem there. He was also one of Levi-Strauss's best students, too, and Levi-Strauss would not speak to Lacan either. So there are a lot of, little anecdotal, moments, stories around it that we all like to talk about over a good bottle of wine, or, even in classes, to give a little bit of the background.
Michael,
but yeah.
Oh, I just had a question. I mean, I'm sure we'll come back to this, as
Sure.
the later part of the book. But, given that, and I agree with you that it seems like their project is not resistance, but, sort of capturing aspects of capitalism and then taking them beyond the limit capital imposes, which I think is very Marxist. I think that Marx is.
Oh yeah, no, they're communists to the core. I mean, they really are. I mean,
right. Yeah.
I mean, in the most militant, original sense. Yeah. Yeah.
But what do you see as the actual social or political practice that is implied in this analysis? It's very hard for me, because it also seems like that movement, that gesture it has its own kind of romance, right? Of sort of like, the courage to just move into this deterritorialized something, right? And it seems like that lends itself so easily to being recuperated by capital's operation, its logics. So I but they don't seem to be talking about building a new kind of political party, or are they? I mean, what is actually?
No, I think the first attack was basically on the psychiatric institutions of their day.
Right,
that was really the first area of struggle was there, and then of course, what Rudy Dutschke said, that they were not really interested in the long march through the institutions. They wanted a continual, incessant, relentless critique, if you will, of the institutional structures and how much.
But then what's the positive moment? Like it's not clear to me what they're not talking about a new kind of clinical practice, as far as I can tell. Although maybe
I guess the schizoid analysis would be a new kind of clinical practice. You would open it's like abolition democracy. If you eliminate the prisons, right? What happens? The people get back into the world, the open air, the open sea, the contingencies. I mean, I'm not so sure they have a direct program, but in a certain way, the working through, again, is a full-fledged, relentless critique. This has nothing to do with any kind of attempt towards recovery. They're really not interested in this. Yeah. But my critique of the book is it doesn't have enough care. The therapeutic care is not there. You feel the care but it's not really on the basis. I mean, I would, if I were to build on this book, in a sense, in terms of a political formation, I would integrate the Heideggerian notion of care into this as well. And then you would really have something in terms of the new being in the world, or you would have a different kind of openness towards the future. But yeah, I mean, in a way too, Guattari's politics as background was Trotskyist and then mutual aid. And this was something that they all went through, during the 70s and the 80s, and then it became the relationship to the ecological horizon in the 80s and 90s. He became red-green, if you will, in a very original, a very different kind of way. So, but in terms of, building a party, right, or a new thing, they're not interested in party formations, right? Yeah. It's more, if to put it in more standard Marxist language, is more agitprop, in some ways, that's pushing to the limit in many ways that cannot be recoded. They're really trying to get out of this, in a sense. Look, I heard Lyotard personally. I remember this when he argued with Richard Rorty. This was I remember vividly, 1984, where Lyotard gave a paper, and I had an advance, luckily, a copy of it in English, but he gave it in French, and this was in Baltimore. And he just said, "Shall we continue to organize? Is it worth it?" And as most of us know, Lyotard's, major thing, and he was very close to these people. He wrote a book, departing from Marx and Freud, Derivé, Marx and Freud down, or Driftworks as it was translated. But anyway, he said, is it possible to recoup the project of the Enlightenment? He went against this, right? And in a way, this whole notion of the grand narrative of emancipation, and in some ways, in a different way, they're not thinking about this Kantian program of the Enlightenment that's taken up by, quote, Western democracy, or any possibility of reform is very much outside their thought processes at this point. Yeah. So this is not where they're going. Yeah. There's a full-fledged critique of that in many ways. So they're not interested in that emancipatory discourse. Yeah. And, it could be said the same of the Althusserian position between the young humanistic Marx and the, ahumanistic Marx, or the mature Marx, how he distinguishes this. And, the Althusserian strategy, is to take the 1845 German ideology, and that's the rupture. There's no continuity, there's no evolution in Marxist thought after that moment. That is a break into the symptomatic reading of Capital and the creation of new vocabulary and the creation of new concepts. So I think really the strategy of this book, going back to your question, the political project, is to create new concepts that give us much greater understanding and maybe the possibility of a new kind of praxis. What that looks like, I don't know, but I'm certainly for abolition democracy. I'm more afraid of the cops than I am of the people in the jails. Right. At this, personally, anyway, I use that as a reductive, thought. But anyway, all to say, I think they're trying to go there. Yeah, in many ways. Yeah, in a different way. So yeah, I mean, all the strategy, in the English departments and literature departments of the end of the grand narratives, the epic form of fiction, et cetera. The experimental writing that takes place. Of course, the small narrative, their book on Kafka, minor literature, which has been criticized by many critics, including Marxist critics like Franco Moretti, who's, back in the day was first rate. I don't like his positivist approach to literature now. But anyway, they are really looking at minor literature here too. Think about this. It's Artaud, who we don't read on a daily basis. We don't really talk about the Balinese theater, a theater. We don't really talk about the theater of cruelty. We don't really talk about Nietzsche, how bad this really is to exist. I'm going to read the passage in a second. When you really think about this and you take, we just need to take Nietzsche literally in terms of why this is not romantic and why it's, very different. So, yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, Carl. I don't know what quote political form this takes, in a way. This is not I don't think they ever really articulated that. For Deleuze was a professor of philosophy who thought philosophy was the invention of concepts, right? That's what he thought its activity was. Thinking as action, thinking and acting together. Action was in the thinking, in the building of the new conceptual vocabulary. And his fellow travelers were the Wim Wenders of the world, the cinema, the Chantal Ackermans, the middle period Godard, right, etc. You can begin to think about the artists. Francis Bacon, the artist, right, in a sense, yeah. So yeah. Bruno, please, yeah.
Yes. No, I just wanted to say that perhaps the political practice that they envision is precisely included, reflected in that sentence, not even a sentence that I read in other moments of this book as well. But when they speak on page 137 of these local fires patiently kindled for a generalized explosion, which is also the molecular revolution, after all, of Guattari.
The molecular revolution.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. So
yeah. I mean, for those of you interested in the politics later, the book, and I have a copy here, it's called Molecular Revolution, Psychiatry and Politics. And this is what Guattari engaged. It was published by Penguin, ironically. It wasn't one of the schizoid, semiotext, moments, but it's very good. I mean, he talks about the Anti-Oedipus in this. He talks about his relationship, again, to institutional psychotherapy, the new vocabulary, the whole notion, Hugo, by the way, of the machinic is engaged here, and structure together. So, I mean, this is very interesting, and again, we have a lot of emphasis on the work of Gilles Deleuze, but, Guattari really had a lot going on in his, in his practice, in his head. And, this was a very good friend of Negre's and very close to the Italian autonomists and very active in the European network of anti-psychiatry and Radio Alicia, which was a liberating moment in a certain way. It was a kind of way of not just saying they're crazy, get them off the subway, right? Or they need to be institutionalized, etc. So this was a very, very different time period. I guess our task is to say, this isn't so far away from us, and what can we take from it to move, into our own very uncertain future, the pandemic era, if you will, and how we can use this. But I want to go just to a question. A thing here. The primitive territorial machine, to go back to this notion of machine, because this is what they're going to concentrate on, the sauvage, the wildness, and in the beginning, so to speak, in terms of their attempt towards universal history. So the primitive, and this is on page 164 in my text. This is towards the end, actually the last, second to last paragraph of section 1 of part 3. The primitive territorial machine codes flows, it invests organs and marks bodies to such a degree that circulating - exchanging is a secondary activity in comparison with the task that sums up all the others. Marking bodies, which are the earth's product. The essence of the recording, inscribing socius, insofar as it lays claim to the productive forces and distributes the agents of production, resides in these operations: tattooing, excising, incising, carving, scarifying, mutilating, encircling, and initiating. Nietzsche, thus defined the morality of mores, the labor performed by man upon himself during the greater part of the existence of the human race, the entire prehistoric labor. A system of valuations, and this is very important. I like this much better than Parsonian, Durkheimian language. A system of evaluations possessing the force of law concerning the various members and parts of the body. Not only is the criminal deprived of organs according to a regime of collective investments, not only is the one who has to be eaten according to social rules, as exact as those followed in carving up and proportion a steer, but the man who enjoys the full exercise of his rights and duties has his whole body marked under a regime that consigns his organs and their exercise to the collectivity. The privatization of the organs will only begin with the shame felt by man at the sight of man. For it is a founding act, important, and that the organs be honed into the socius and that the flows run over its surface, through which man ceases to be a biological organism and becomes a full body, an earth, right? To which his organs become attached, where they are attracted, repelled, miraculated, following the requirements of a socius. So instead of earth, a horizon, between Heidegger gods and mortals, right? The fourfold. This is a twofold in a way between the earth and the socius, right? In a way, very, very interesting. Nietzsche says it is a matter of creating a memory for man, and man who was constituted by means of an active faculty of forgetting, by means of a repression of biological memory, must create an other memory, one that is collective, a memory of words, or utterances is better in terms of the paddle, and no longer a memory of things, a memory of signs, and no longer of effects. This organization, which traces its signs directly on the body, constitutes a system of cruelty, a terrible alphabet. I like this phrase, and terrible. I mean, for me, I'm sorry. I think this is very rigorous in many ways. Perhaps indeed there was nothing more fearful, and this is Nietzsche speaking in the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals, and uncanny in the whole prehistory of man than his mnemotechnics. Man could never do without blood, torture, and sacrifices when he felt the need to create a memory for himself. The most dreadful sacrifices and pledges, the most repulsive mutilations, the cruelest rites of all the religious cults, one only has to look at the former codes, and this is very interesting, and this is what Foucault does, by the way, to look at the former codes of punishments to understand what effort it costs on this earth to breed a nation of thinkers. Interesting, right? In a way, yeah? To breed a nation of thinkers. Cruelty has nothing to do with some ill-defined or natural violence that may be commissioned to explain. Forget these explanations on TV of why someone, blows up a mall or something, and picks up the guns, right? To explain the history of mankind. Cruelty is the movement of culture that is realized in bodies and inscribed on them, belaboring them. This is what cruelty means. This culture is not the movement of ideology. On the contrary, it forcefully injects production into desire, and conversely, it forcibly inserts desire into social production and reproduction. For even death, punishment, and torture are desired, and are instances of production. Compare the history of fatalism. It makes men or their organs into the parts and wheels of the social machine. The sign is a position of desire, but the first signs are the territorial, and this is important, territorial signs that plant their flags in bodies. The territorial signs that plant their flags in bodies. And if one wants to call this inscription in naked flesh writing, this is very important, then it must be said that speech, in fact, presupposes writing. Here's your Derridian, moment too here. Yeah. And that is the cruel system of inscribed signs that renders man capable of language and gives him a memory of the spoken word. This is very important for the inscribing socius as we go forward. So we're beginning to see the entry, if you will, it's been there throughout, but the Nietzschean genealogy, the genealogical method, is now playing out in this as much as, quote, the dialectic and the types of syntheses, this genealogical attempt, especially through cruelty and territoriality.
Michael,
So,
I have a question. So
yeah,
just,
okay.
So the way you're reading this is when they're talking about, and I'm even going back a little bit, this a page further, the method of primitive territorial machine in this sense is in this sense the collective investment of the organs, and then they say instituted as partial objects distributed on the socius and attached to it. And then in the passage you read, they talk about organs are hewn to the socius. So do you interpret what they're linking that to Nietzsche and the idea of the torture or the scarring or the violence that's brought against the body? Correct? Is when
Yeah,
they
I would say that. I mean, in a way, I don't think they're afraid of talking about the violence at the, quote, origin, if you will, or at the site in which this primitive territorial machine develops, right? This is about the site where it's developing, and Nietzsche's looking at how does man is that animal that it makes him different from the animal because he has memory, right? And memory then is a system, this mnemotechnics of system of signs and inscriptions, and they're really looking at the writing of the body, very much like Derrida, that the Western tradition is privileged speech over writing, and there's this repression of writing that is going on. And this is stuff that becomes very active in the French scene in the 1960s, and certainly more so in the 70s in terms of its dissemination. I mean, that's where this is going. Yeah, in many ways. Yeah. There's a note on Derrida, by the way, on page 161, in which they do mention Derrida. And let me just see, I'm going to need better light to get to it. I'm sorry about that. Adler and Carty, and Adler and Carty it's not Alfred Adler, it's an ethnologist, and Michel Carty, who were both 50s anthropologists who came out of the school of Georges Devereux. Right, anyway, Jacques Derrida wrote in a commentary on Rousseau, before the feast, there was no incest because there was no prohibition of incest. After the feast, there is no longer any incest because it is prohibited. The feast itself would be the incest itself if any such thing itself could take place. This is from De la Chromatologie in the second section after the deconstruction of Saussurean linguistics, the second part on Rousseau and the origin, in which the critique of Levi-Strauss is leveled. Yeah. So I mean, again, and I'm not saying this is radical innocence. This again is their way of going back to what is this? Remember, the chapter is about doing a universal history in a retrospective way, and then pushing this to the invention of Oedipus in terms of that most massive reterritorializing machine, capitalism. So this is what they're doing here, if you can think of these layers and these kind of successive stages, and they don't work, as in a linear, this is much more of a spiraling on a horizontal plane. There's a plane of immanence always working here alongside their planes of expression. I think this is always, there are multiple registers always working. So, I mean, Carl, you bring up, great questions, but I think this is about, again, them to the Deleuze and Guattari going back to this, the originary, if you will, machine, right? The originary territorial machine, which is populated by the.
Yeah, but they seem to be linking it to
right.
Nietzsche of the genealogy of morals, where
Yes, of course. Yeah. Well, that's what Nietzsche is doing too. How did we get memory?
I guess I
What
just
is memory? What does memory really mean? Why do we remember certain things?
right.
What does the psychoanalyst do with trauma? You know, I mean, in a sense.
Yeah, yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I guess I just, maybe this is a minor and irrelevant point, but are there other pathways through which primitive social organizations come into being other than violent, bloody rites that are I mean, I guess I initially read it.
Well, I'm all ears on that. I mean, in a way, I mean, I'm all ears, but I don't know.
Yeah.
To be honest with you, I don't think it was, that is in fact Derrida's, the naivete of a Rousseau. Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. We're born into, this, in a way, and Bruno, yes.
Yeah, no, just two things. One, that actually they have an explicit reference to Derrida on page 202, the last paragraph, where they say that he was correct precisely in saying that every language presupposes a writing system. So they go back to that in an explicit way.
Right.
But also because this writing is not only, of course, the writing on paper or whatever we do now, but the writing on the body, on the naked body, the inscription. Yeah. Yes, and in this paragraph, going back to page 145, the paragraph you just read, I think that here, with of course the clear reference to Nietzsche, but also what Eloy was saying about Foucault in the history of sexuality, but there is here already also that idea of the productive type, and not only repressive, but the productive type of power, and the formation of bodies that they say are basically attached to the social machine, but they produce themselves, right? Which is then the production, as we know, of subjectivity and so on. So it is there. So, but it is this kind of forced production forced in the sense through the cruelty and the violence that Nietzsche speaks of. But there is this reference as well, this link as well, I believe, to precisely what then Foucault does with power. Right? I mean, it forcibly injects production into...
Please. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I'm reading to desire, and conversely, it forcibly inserts desire into social production and reproduction.
Right.
It's also Marxist as well.
Right. But I mean, really, I think the important part here again is this wildness. I'm trying to avoid the language of the savage, so to speak, or the tattooed, being, if you will, and the idea here is, as you say, how we are written, how we are inscribed, and really in a way that inscription, in a sense, is before anything else, right? This inscription, right? And it is a very cruel act of how the body is written, right, under this, and this is one of the reasons he speaks later to Derrida on the quote, this early territorial machine is not concerned with incest. They who could care less? So it's my sister that married the tribe next door, or I married my sister, but she's good for relations with the tribe that occupies territory next to me, etc. Incest was not taken seriously, right? And in this way, this is what they're speaking to. This is an attempt to go back and see how laws are actually created. What are this system, if you will, of discipline and punish, if you will, right? Again, I think both Guattari and Deleuze, and Deleuze picks this up from Burroughs, are situated between disciplinary practices, right? A society of disciplinary practices through institutional controls, and then, of course, the society of control. And we're becoming more and more, in this society of control as we go on. I mean, this is not anything new. I mean, the inscriptions are happening. We're now marked. We're marked by vaccination. We are marked by all kinds of, think about this and where we are today, how this production of new codes, this new kind of machine is operating the socius with us. Yeah, in a sense.
And no, if I may also, going back to Carl, in Carl's question, the last one, whether there would be another path, if I understood. No, but what we were reading and discussing right now, that relates to the question, makes me think also of Silvia Federici and her account in Caliban and the Witch, which is precisely on women, the body, primitive accumulation, where the question of these violent methods and the cruelty also, and this inscription on the body come back in important ways.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Add something.
Yeah, please, Josepha. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think what you said before, I think we tend to look at this, I think, as historical, and it is in a way, and it's not in a way, I think.
Right.
And I think what you said before, so I think it's historical in a way that it was very literal. I mean, if you think of Aztec cultures, Andean cultures,
right.
Cutting, you remember, bleeding, especially the male, the Aztec emperor, let's say, would cut, would cut himself, and then the bleeding will, imply that he's, uniting with the other spheres. So that was literal. So if you look at other books, I remember this woman wrote this whole book on the Bible. So you can see the symbolic, violence, let's say, and also literal violence. And I can't remember the name of her book. I remember the color, light blue, but it's all about, this.
Temper the violence with a light blue. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so the violence is there. So it's not as literal, let's say.
Right.
So in a way, these primitive territorial machines are still on, like you said. But I think they're both. So I think what's really hard to accept, I think, with Deleuze is that he says that, there's this moment of the territory as being the machine that dominates, and then you have the despot, and then you have capitalism. So, however, throughout these systems, like even in the capitalist system, you have the other systems in there. So in a way, it's not really, so they're both, they're dominant in a way, historical, let's say, and at the same time, they coexist. So it seems like what you were saying is that idea of the virtual, sometimes you forget. For instance, people in the Andes, the Aymara people kept going like this with their hands, and linguists were saying, what are they saying? Every time they go forward, they're thinking of the past. So basically the body, the notion of time was in the body itself. By them saying like this, they were pointing at the past was always in front of you. So the past was always in front, but they didn't know anymore. But their body knew. So this linguist, videotape all these people that spoke the language, didn't speak the language, only spoke Spanish, etc. They all were going like that. So the inscription was in their body even to today. This linguist happened to see it and interpret, this notion of time. That's what's interesting. So I think that's really hard with the book, it's hard to keep both things going, like as an evolution, let's say, quote unquote, and as a virtual thing that keeps on.
Well, I think it's best to read again the book in a kind of sense of registers. And as you said, spiraling of successive stages, right? And there is this kind of prospective, retrospective movement always going on too. So it's not a straightforward, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, or for that matter, the kind of standard Kantian synthesis that we understand of how the mind works at times, or the Hegelian synthesis of the reconciliation, between opposites in the synthetic operations. So if we can read at this level, I think we're going to really get much more, because again, this is a very experimental book. It's not something that is supposed to be, quote unquote, built on a logical treatise level. It's something that is, certainly about an exchange between multiple, people. They used to say we weren't one, we were many, and we weren't two, we were many, et cetera, that went into this. And, the writing, and I think I mentioned this last week, and, that Guattari was going through a serious writing block. So Deleuze would have him associate every morning, and then they would review the text at the end of the day. And Deleuze did a lot of the editing. However, a lot of the editing of this section, and I'm trying to share this because it may give us something to work with. This was sent to both Adler and the other, I think his name was Contre. They were reviewing this section on the findings of anthropology, right, during this period. So again, they're not just coming out of the blue. There's a lot of work going on in France, African Oedipus, right, the colonies, right. Of course, Fanon is here. He's mentioned later, but and directly. But yeah, there's a lot of work going on here of this anthropologists. Yeah, Michel Carté, Andreas Zerplini, and Alfred Adler, none of whom were read in the United States, all part of, one did work on the Sorcerer King, and of course the Guayaki Indian, right, and the Paraguayan Ake woman, right, who were hunters and gatherers. And there was an analysis of the dreams there. They were completely different than what dreams they were getting in the West, right, in many ways. And so there's a lot going on here. What ultimately gives rise to myth, right, in a sense? They're really looking at that in terms of the social too, as well. So remember, Pierre Clostret's Society Against the State, Lucien Sabag on structural, Marxism and anthropology during this period are two very, very prominent anthropologists in the world, right? At this time. And Sabag was, again, Tunisian. He wrote on personality theory as well. So, so we're also, and Josepha, you know this, and Eloy in a different way in terms of they're dealing with people of the Andes in many ways. Levi-Strauss's work, as you know, was in Brazil, right? These were the places that a lot of these moments, that we were talking about the dismemberment, right? Dismembering earlier. So they are studying this through their own these schools of anthropology during the point. They actually, some of these groups came up with theories of infantile autism based on a Senegalese, what they call the Senegalese syndrome, So this is very, very rich stuff, in a way, in terms of how we come to both the label and the classification. But so I want to make, so all of these people are playing out here when you begin to get into, and actually they mentioned Devereux, and they mentioned, in the footnotes here, in this section actively, and even Edmund Leach, good old Edmund Leach of the Anglo world, another anthropologist. So again, this is not just a work of philosophy or militant psychoanalysis. This is a work that is extremely rich in terms of its transdisciplinary, or at least for lack of a better term, interdisciplinary force and structure. So again, Hugo, please, yeah.
So I was also thinking that perhaps in relation to the notions here of sacrifice and blood sacrifice, and
right,
the conjunction or proximity of references to Nietzsche to these set of ideas, that there's also, I think, a rethinking of the kind of Judeo-Christian mythology as well, and that the sort of Christological metaphysics that has dominated Western thought, I think, is also being debunked, because there's a sense that, you know, that is the ultimate terminal point at which, you know, Western civilizations has been stuck on the horns of that, if you will, on the, you know, the turning point of that event that is about, you know, sacrifice and blood sacrifice in particular, and is, you know, tied to the notion of a patriarchal father sacrificing, you know, his son, and that, you know, there's the structuring of culture and consciousness around that. And I think they don't literally say that. There is a sort of reference to, yes, the tattooing and the sort of anthropological look at the non-European sort of cultural practice outside of the sphere of you know, Western history, you know, a bit, you know, like a kind, you know, sort of looking outside of that frame. But I think it's meant to also refer back to, you know, the Judeo-Christian framework, which,
Yeah, sure. I mean, Abraham is, yeah.
From which Freud is born, and, you know, which gives rise to psychoanalysis, and the, you know, the way in which these structures of thought inscribe a certain order into if you will, the socius, that I think they're seeking to be liberated from, and to liberate us from.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, remember, Abraham is really territorial, right? I mean, it's territorial representation in the beginning, right? And of course, the Nietzschean cry against Christology is Dionysius against the crucified, the body, the sacrifice, the cruel machinery, etc. Right? And, you know, if you take up Nietzsche's, you know, everything from the will to power and the diagnostic, Christianity leads to nihilism. Right? I mean, this is what it is. Its essence is basically nothing. It's the will to will nothing at the end, you know, which is, of course, played out in the theater with Beckett's Waiting for Godot and many other, you know, contemporary, you know, and I like what they say, you know, it's not that the conscious mind is so, you know, it goes, so what when you hear God is dead, the joyful wisdom of Nietzsche or whatever, right? You know, in a sense, this is not really news to the conscious mind, in a sense. It's kind of like, so what? And they want to get on to different levels here. And this is the thing. And we have a very hard time, going back to this notion of romance, we have a very hard time letting go of our humanism, right? I mean, you know, in some ways. And it depends on how you have to define that. But is that humanism in a certain way a kind of re-Oedipalization or a re-territorialization that is taking place in our thought, you know, in a sense, instead of trying to think beyond that? Carl, you wanted to say something? I'm sorry. Yeah.
No.
Okay. I saw you. Yeah. Okay. But I mean, you know, that's one way of thinking about the humanist controversy, in a sense. Has the humanism blocked us in terms of being able to really think the contingencies of the future and, you know, the nation of thinkers, as Nietzsche said, this new breed of philosophers, right? In some ways. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Yeah.
I want to propose.
Yeah, sure, please. Yeah.
Another way of looking at it.
Sure, please. Of all means.
They've constructed this kind of apparatus to understand history.
Right.
And
at least in this section. Yeah.
Could it be a retrospective reconstruction of the past, in the sense of, you know, inscribing, you know, contemporary form of inscription essentially has assumed the form of the market. But here, if we take and use this to understand primitive societies, put that in quotes,
yeah,
could it be that what they're doing is essentially marshaling this way of understanding the world and projecting it into the past to understand it? I'm not saying this critically. Again, we always do that.
I'm with you there. I think this is a prospective, retrospective, you know, take on history, and that their notion of universal history is to be taken seriously in that regard. Yes. Yeah.
So it's not that, I mean, we too often see this in a positive sense, as if this actually exists. We need to see this the way in which this is a process of active construction that's going on, and in terms of their retrospective analysis.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're taking, and the reason I mentioned these schools of anthropology, I mean, again, I mean, at least to my mind, when I read this stuff, we're very bereft of, really great anthropological findings in the United States. And it seems like the French really took the lead on this in the 20th century, especially with Levi-Strauss and his structuralist school, and of course the earlier schools like Devereux and others. And you can see this working way, Gautier, the Marxists, et cetera, Emmanuel Terray. So in a way, they're taking these findings that they're seeing, and in a way, the interesting thing, the difference between the French state when they send someone on a mission and the American state is the French go there to kind of much more subtly think of ways they can colonize, whereas the Americans are there to directly exploit or directly, take over. So I think we ought to keep this in mind too, in terms of this, the state thinking and its relationship to sending people to different places. But yeah, I mean, I agree with you completely. The active construction here is a retrospective rethinking, et cetera. And what they're interested in now, I mean, in terms of the contemporary period, is these schizzes, these breaks and ruptures that can possibly happen, and again, they're looking at this again, the end of Oedipus, the end of, quote, let us push capitalism to its very limit of absolute deterritorialization. This is where they're going. I'm not so sure this is a great idea, given what we see in terms of, but, in a way, this is where they're coming from. They're not reformists in the traditional sense, right? In a way, they are revolutionists in the way that they want to push this to the limit. And they see the schizophrenic, again, as both the symptom and as a way of reading the future together. Yeah.
One of the things,
please.
Sort of going off on a different track, but that I think it relates to all this is sort of, the writing and the inscribing and the replacement, or sort of the schizophrenic as the model of how the unconscious operates. One of the things I got out of this is it seems like they're very much in that moment where language is being divorced, at least they're trying to divorce it from this notion of representation.
Right, absolutely.
Sort of mediated levels and but I guess for me, this, like, I just keep coming back to that question exactly of mediation. And I think one of my critiques so far, although we haven't gone to the end, is that they don't really reconstruct the mediations. Again, it falls back into, as I see it, a kind of a functionalist explanation when they actually talk about how these operations are instantiated. And so, yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect of this. And again, the people who are more deeply versed in psychoanalysis, I'd be interested in knowing what they think about this as a model of how the human psyche works. Because, as I understand Freud, Freud and Marx are similar in the sense that there are these underlying structures that are more, in some sense, essential, and that there are these complex mediations that then produce the observable phenomenon. And it seems like they're dissolving and collapsing that distinction. And that I have questions about that. Just it doesn't. Again, I'll just leave it at that, because if you don't have a theory of mediation, it seems that you lose a vast amount of explanation to actually, how does a neurotic symptom evolve? How does capitalist crisis take place, right? That there's all these complex mechanisms, right, through which underlying essential formations appear at the level of everyday surface life. So, that's something to me that seems very prominent in this book and very much out of that time of, that moment in French intellectual culture.
Do either David, you want to make a comment on this, or Jane, or anybody else about this role of psychoanalysis? You're still muted, David. I see you're trying. Yeah.
No, I think it's a really great question, Carl. And in my limited understanding of them, I think where they still most don't understand Freud is, for them, and Michael, you'll have to weigh in if this is true.
Yeah, no problem.
That for them, there's a celebration of what they would call the perverse, in that for them, the neurotic is really a problem in that it's an interruption of flow of many types of things as the neurotic becomes involved with this very tepid anemic system which substitutes, quotes, real gratifications for the sort of shadow of the symptom, which is really several steps removed from the original type of gratification which is now repressed. Where for them, the perversion in all of its glory is allowing flow to happen. All of the flows of production, what they kind of, in these passages we're reading now, look at all the eruptions of the earth, the shitting, the pissing, the territorialities, the massive eruptive chaos of the body in its full glory are kind of allowed to really move forwards. And the perverse, I think, is really quite critical to them in making the socius alive, dynamic, blood-sucking, rich, unhindered. And I think it's where they're kind of almost equating perversion with the Nietzschean, particularly in the will to power. I don't know that Freud himself really saw the perverse quite in that way. I mean, I think in the later Freud, again, where there's more vertical splitting of the ego, the patient's, the notion of the fetish as being kind of constitutive of an oscillating reality, there's a potential power for Freud in oscillating between a fixed point of your potency is really allowed to flow if you get the shoe, or you get the fetish object, or you get whatever that thing is that allows your fantasy systems to really get activated. But it also is potentially for Freud a holding back of something, a la the case of the Wolfman, where there were many things the Wolfman could not see, and the oscillation didn't always work so successfully. So what I was going to try is, I was trying to understand the socius. So of all things, I looked this up on Wikipedia, and it did feel like it kind of circles in, Carl, to I think your question, and situates this a little bit historically, which is this remark by a philosopher named Kenneth Surin, who says that
he's a good guy, so I'm glad he wrote the Wikipedia. Yeah, I'll vouch for him.
Well, vouch for him. Good. He gets the Michael approval, but he kind of looks at the idea of, them really starting really back in the whole history of philosophy with the Greeks, and looking at the idea that, to use their language, he says that they are interested in undoing the tenets that underlie traditional philosophy, which subtend the constitution of the social order. These principles are embodied in what Deleuze and Guattari call the socius. The well-known philosophical counter-tradition inaugurated by Friedrich Nietzsche and continued by Martin Heidegger undertook a dismantling of the transcendental basis of traditional philosophy, and the work of Deleuze is to be located exactly in this tradition. For Deleuze, as for Nietzsche, an entire tradition extends from Plato to Kant, in which it is declared that the yardstick of knowledge is verisimilitude. In Plato's case, verisimilitude derives from an ideal, quote, world of forms, the transcendent, whereas for Immanuel Kant, the world of the transcendent was banished to the realm of the, quote, noumenal absolute. I would argue here, their reading of Freud is that the perversion is exactly undoing the noumenal absolute by saying there is an endless possibilities of oscillations of fetishistic fantasy systems that really are where the action is, much more like the ascending and descending processes Nietzsche is writing about in Will to Power. He goes on to say here, Kant, though, insisted that the counterpart to the noumenal world, for example, the world of phenomena, was constituted by the activity itself of the transcendental, or non-empirically given subject of possible experience. Again, perversion in Freud is always looking at what's possible if you oscillate. What happens in your fantasy if you're not the neurotic who is repressing and stopping the flow? Experience becomes more possible. In their reflection on the socius, conducted throughout the volumes of Capitalism and Schizophrenia, in the two volumes, Deleuze and Guattari seek what amounts to a comprehensive undoing of the transcendental basis of the constitution of the social order. And in so doing, they seek to do this precisely because it will destroy the idea of transcendental empiricism, in which the basis for the constitution of the real, as opposed to the possible, experience is sought. This project is, quotes, transcendental insofar that the conditions for real experience requires a non-empirical organization of the objects of experience. Through the source of this organization, it is not a transcendental subject a la Kant, but rather a very form in which real objects and experiences are experienced as active and dynamic. In Anti-Oedipus, the socius is said to be necessary, crucial in fact, because desiring production is coterminous with social production and reproduction, and for the latter to take place, desire has to be coded and recoded so that subjects can be prepared for their social roles and functions. The last part of that seemed a little conservative, actually, of saying coded for their social roles and functions, but it does seem that that is partly what they are saying, is that in a way that seems similar to Freud, that at the ending of the soul, at the ending of an analysis, terminable and interminable, there would be a radical reworking of how the subject relates to all of these pseudo-substitutions for the thing they thought they were upset about is really now going to be dismantled. So the person who thought they were pissed off because they thought they didn't get a raise, or that their book wasn't published, or that they got rejected in a particular situation, is liberated to begin seeing not just what was unveiled by the analysis in terms of what was really the driving force behind all of that, but is more able to, as they engage the socius, to see any given conflict as part of an endless shifting matrix of ongoing conflicts which are now going to be responded to with a greater degree of libidinal power and force if the barriers of the blocks to the flow are lifted. Michael, would you say that's on
yeah,
target?
that's I mean, very good. I mean, yeah, I mean, I mean, I like the way you go to the levels of the mediation and all of this. But again, I think Deleuze and Guattari, just to be, somewhat faithful to their project, aren't really interested so much in all those mediations, right? They're interested again in, saying, look, this is part of a historical moment which develops under the, quote, civilized form, right? That Oedipus, which was a work of fiction, a fictive element, has become an institution, right, in a sense, and that they're looking at this through the categories of representation, right? And that their analysis here is much more about flows, right? Always about flows. So, for example, you have two axes of flows in this chapter. One is of course, the filiation, right, of which marriage comes from, etc. I mean, the relationship of the child to the parent, my mistake. The filiation, how the flux is coded. And then the other is the alliance of the relationship that goes, along those lines in terms of marriage, kinship, relations, and all of that. So they make a big thing about this, how filiation and alliance works vis-a-vis, this primitive territorial machine, right? That the filiation is continuous, whereas the alliance becomes discontinuous. And this somehow works out that the discontinuous alliance that happens creates the somatic body, right, in a way. They always want to go back to this body. So the somatic body is always operative because, the family structures, this alliance in the beginning doesn't care at all about Oedipus. It comes at the end, right? Again, retrospective in a sense. So this is what I think they're fighting, is this imposed construct. I mean, I just want to re-emphasize. I understand what you're saying, I think, and it's, brilliantly articulated by you about perversion and all these levels, and what Kenneth Soren does too. And about, the genius of Freud, the ability to go back and revise and go through multiple levels, and of course registers like that. But their stake is much more about social repression, right, in relation to the psychic repression. It's not only about the psychic. They're not writing a book only about anti-Freud. They're actually writing, or at least this text is an attempt to look at the political economy, of how we got here, right? And how do we get out of this pushing this awful system to its limit, and how do we get there? What is its both its symptom and its solution in a way? And it's not a party, to go back to what Carl said, and it's not, in a way, as far as it got, was a kind of, deconstruction, if you will, and a creation of some kind of alternative spaces, psychiatric, institutional flows, certainly a lot about revolutionary movements during the 70s. They were very active in both, in different ways, Deleuze in the seminars, Guattari much more active in terms of hands-on movements, right? What's happening. So yeah, I appreciate what you say, and Kenneth Soren is a professor at Duke, and is very bright, and very very good, and I'm glad he did that, in a sense. But I think what we miss in some ways is this whole notion. They're really trying to create this dynamic, and you've read a little bit of Eugene Holland's work, right? They're trying to really create this movement of territorial, representation, and how it's still trapped within representation. I don't think we're going to have time to go there. We can certainly pick up with that next week, this whole question of representation and what they do with it. And then how does one go from territorialization to deterritorialization, then back to reterritorialization, and then how do you push that reterritorialization to the end part? And they use Marx very effectively in this, the Marx of the young Marx, or the Marx of the Manifesto, in which they talk about what capitalism does. And people forget this because everybody's always, it's a crisis. Well, that's what makes capitalism, is crisis. It's the stupidest language, when the crisis of this, the crisis of that. This is what capitalism thrives on. How look what's happened during the pandemic. 634 billionaires have accumulated $1.3 trillion in newly formed fictitious capital through their stock portfolios, et cetera, and investments. Bill Gates is the #1 holder of agricultural land in the United States at this point. They thrive on this stuff. So, to talk about crisis. But anyway, going back to the thing, Marx says the constant revolutionizing of production and uninterrupted disturbances, of all social conditions. And I think this is what Deleuze and Guattari are trying to look at always. This is their moment here. So you have the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. You have the consumption problem, consumerism, the cycles of disinvestment and reinvestment, deterritorialization, closing of factories, etc. The retooling of labor skills. All of these things become part of this, relationship of deterritorialization back to reterritorialization. And they're thinking that we're stuck because we don't, I'm not saying that they're absolutely right, or that this is the only way out, but they're trying to work towards some kind of point at the end, right, if you will, a terminal point, which they consider the relationship both of Oedipal as a myth, the family structure, the holy familialism, alongside that of the complete deterritorialization that capitalism needs to go under to absolute, not just relative, in a way, so that it ultimately collapses. So the relative deterritorialization, this new thing on the front page of the New York Times, big news to my mind, that the factory in Baltimore completely fucked up on the making of the vaccines, right? Yeah, so we're short another 100 million vaccines, et cetera, right? This is a form of deterritorialization, and showing, but it'd be reterritorialized tomorrow. So they're trying to look at this well beyond. Yeah, go ahead, Carl. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I also just, I didn't totally follow everything you said, David, in terms of the perversion and how that relates to the mediation. I did, if you could clarify that, but just to your point, Michael, and again, we're not yet to the end of the book, but you can't, capitalism, to say that capitalism has this deterritorializing logic, so to speak, and then there's kind of this dialectic of reterritorialization. That's interesting and I think useful, but you can't explain capital on that basis. That's one of its phenomenon or its characteristics. But Marx, I think, would say that, well, yes, that's interesting, but we actually have to understand categories such as value, surplus value, fixed capital, all these.
Bring all that in, though.
Right. So
they're starting that way. They're looking at territorial and deterritorialization vis-a-vis representation, language, inscription. All of these things are interrelated in a certain way, right? How do you get reinscribed in terms of, the logic of consumption, the consumption patterns that Madison Avenue brings you, which is part of a psychic register, right? In a sense, how do we get sold on that basis? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, just again, we'll get into this later. I don't, but there's a very complex and very extended argument. I mean, I think one of the things that really distinguishes Marx when you read the 3 volumes of Capital, and then there's also the theories of surplus value, but the 3 volumes of Capital is that there's a single argument that's actually carried out throughout those whole books for 2,000 pages, and it actually has a certain structure. And, again, anyone who's read Marx knows that, he starts from what he calls, the cell, the most simple form assumed, and then he unpacks this entire complex of relationship. And he's very clear that he's starting where he starts is not the immediate level at which we encounter capitalist phenomenon. That only comes much later in volume 3.
Right, I understand, but the Althusserian strategy, as you probably know, was to forget the section on the commodity and commodity fetishism, and it was an example of an expressive totality, and you would begin with a chapter on money, and that was a more fruitful way of reading Capital at this point. Yeah, in a sense. So, I mean, I know you work on this, but
no, not all of us.
I want to say, there's one reading of Marx versus another reading of Marx. And,
I know. I mean, there's
going on.
But again, it just relates to this, this appearance essence, is one way to think about it.
Right.
That I think.
But again, I mean, they're looking at libidinal and capital flows together, if we can think about this, right? In a way. Godard once said, the task is to make the images flow faster than the money. We can't do that anymore. This is the interesting thing. If you want to think of it that way, Jean-Luc Godard said, the task is to make the images flow faster than the money, right? And in a way, so for those of you that are readers of Walter Benjamin, he has a wonderful essay. I forgot the exact title of the essay, but it's in, I think it's in the collected work somewhere. I'll see if I can find, on metaphor and metonymy and the roulette wheel and wish fulfillment, right? He's very, very good at this. So there are all these, again, these registers here in a sense. Look, I certainly understand, again, I'm not trying to say we have to go in this with kids' gloves or just accept or, break down all our resistances to reading this. However, I do think that there is a lot here that we could take and learn from, as we go forward. I think, this book was really, this attempt by them was really hit on by the traditional French intellectual class, by a lot of the psychiatric - psychoanalytic, establishments, etc. This was considered the dangerous deviancy of a tendency, right? In a way. This is how it was called. These are the dangerous deviants, Saint Felix and Saint Jules, right? The two saints of the new ship of schizoids, as Richard Leeds, who I guess left us early tonight, but he calls us the new ship of schizoids instead of the ship of fools, as Foucault has in the beginning of Madness and Civilization. So I guess, I mean, look, again, the idea here, and I think they're pretty careful with their methodological precepts. You know, they're dealing on three synthetic levels, right? One, of course, being the connective, right? The first one, in which the connective synthesis is operating here between these, you know, flows of continuity and discontinuity, et cetera. The connective synthesis. And then the disjunctive, which will come later, of which capitalism is the master of, you know, that, or the imperial era, you know, don't do this, says the father, but do it, right? In a sense, and they'll go through this. You know, how do you overcode? Think about this in terms of coding too. How coding is working as well. So and then, you know, they go through, you know, the paralogisms as well. So they have, you know, going back to where we began tonight, you and Beryl, with the structural functionalism and the Durkheimian moment, in a way. They're also using a lot of Kant here, you know, in terms of the synthetic, right, in a way. And so the disjunctive is very, very important for, for them, the unconscious, unlike Lacan, is not structured like a language, but it's structured like two languages. A plane of immanence and a plane of expression, if I could use that, right, in a sense. It's really structured like two languages, right, in a sense, right? Double articulation, if you want to look at the section to follow this up in Mille Plateaux, in 1,000 Plateaus, their second work on capitalism and schizophrenia. So, you know, and again, and then you have the conjunctive synthesis, of which capitalism is great at, right? And the schizophrenia, and then what else is new? So this is another thing that we're going to go, you know, I want to, you know, like, I mean, it's way ahead of us, but page 224, they'll talk about the basis of connections of production, right? And the conjunction is, you know, the consumer, you know, in many ways, at least in my book, 224. Let me see if I can find what paragraph it is. And the application is in civilization. So the operation is happening, right? Yeah, but you need a capitalist formation for the conjunctive, right? Right? Yeah. Right? So, yeah. Let me see, 224, I think was the section, yeah. Yeah, they go on. Decoded desires and desire for descending have already existed. Let me see exactly where this is. This is about 3 paragraphs into the civilized capitalist machine for next week, which we will be reading. But anyway, decoded desires and desire for decoding have already existed. History is full of them, the decoding. But we have seen that only through their encounter in a place and their conjunction in a space, right, it takes time, do decoded flows constitute a desire that, instead of just dreaming or lacking it, actually produces a desire machine that is at the same time both social and technical. That is why capitalism and its break are defined not solely by decoded flows, but by the generalized decoding of flows. The new massive deterritorialization, the conjunction of deterritorialized flows. It is the singular nature of this conjunction that ensures the universality of capitalism. They're looking at what are the a priori conditions for capitalism to exist. They're looking at this through desire, right? Yeah, okay. How does this system come about? Not only the destruction of feudal society, but how does this really come about? By simplifying a lot, we say that the savage territorial machine, again, operated on the basis of connections of production, where we are tonight, right? Connections of production. And that the barbarian despotic machine, which we'll do next week and hopefully move into this section, was based on the disjunction of inscription, derived from the eminent unity. But the capitalist machine, that is the civilized machine, right, will first establish itself on the conjunction. When this occurs, the conjunction no longer merely designates remnants that have escaped coding or consummation consumption, as in the primitive feasts, I read from Derrida, then the feast and so what to the incest of the despot, right? As in the primitive feast, or even the maximum consumption in the extravagance of the despot and his agents, right? When the conjunction moves to the fore in the social machine, it seems on the contrary that it ceases to be tied to enjoyment or to the excess consumption of a class, that it makes history itself into a means of investment, right? Very interesting, a means of investment, and reduces all the decoded flows to production, in a production for production's sake, that rediscovers the primitive connections of labor on the sole condition that they are linked to capital and to the new deterritorialized full body, the true consumer from which they seem to emanate, as in the pact with the devil that Marx describes, the industrial eunuch. So it's your fault if, right? And then he goes on to the principal elements of capital. I guess what again, what we're trying to, point out here is that, again, they're trying to look at what are the conditions for these, if you want to call it these three, epochs in history that they're trying, I'll call them epochs, the savage and the inscribing socius and what that means. In a way, and the birth of mnemotechnics and the systems of writing that inscribe us, to use both the Derridian and the Nietzschean moment. And then secondly, the next stage was the despot, right? And the barbarian, and we can think about historical, but you can fill in the blanks with all kinds of narrations of history and figures. And then thirdly, how do we get to the civilized, right? And they're looking again at this as flows, right? As flows and coding and decoding, always working. So I guess the task is to be able to see this in a revolutionary lens that is able to pick up on what flows are actually being decoded and which are being recoded. And then how do we push it to the limit that we understand, look, if you're going to read the law, read it through Nietzsche. Don't read it through Roscoe Pound or Thomas Jefferson or the framers of the Constitution or the Harvard group of the lawyers. Read it through Nietzsche, because you're going to learn much more about why a system of laws came to be, through these systems of punishment and cruelty. I mean, this is one thing they're doing, in a very different way. Yeah. Also, the social and the socius, as David very articulately presented from Kenneth Soren's notion of the socius and how he talks about it. And he's, it is anti-transcendental. It is grounded. This is about the earth, as Bruno was talking about. It's no longer, earth and horizon. This is earth and world and worlding taking place. Very, very interesting the way they are. Very grounded in materiality, to my mind. In a sense, because again, they want to create, look, the goal of the book is to create a materialist psychiatry, right? I mean, this is the object, to give us conditions and thoughts towards that. Whether or not this is accomplished well, or if we can take elements from this towards liberation from and freedom towards something different, and the reconstruction of something different is another story. But again, let's try to look at this. He talks about the flows of producers and the flows of money, too. And if you really look at finance capital, and you think about Hilferding, and you think about Lenin, imperialism, Hilferding's, quotes on finance capital. If you think about productive capital, industrial capital versus finance capital, they're really looking at this. This is already presupposed in this book. These are not people that did not take a look at Karl Marx. I mean, they read their Marx. I mean, in a way, Guattari was a member of the party for a while as a militant psychoanalyst. These are people that are grounded in this. It might not be, the greatest reading, but you have to remember the French had very different, attempts. The Althusserian moment helped create this, very different moment in film studies and other stuff, a new way of reading capital, if you will. And, in a way, and it's no accident that Derrida used to visit Althusser and bring flowers almost every day when he was in Paris. This was his teacher. This was his friend, in many ways, both coming from, Algeria. So again, I don't know. I mean, the whole thing, Carl, I know you're interested in this. He goes through capital and filiation. They go through this very actively in the theory of money too. They're not just, and they make a point in the beginning of this section of saying this is not geographical territorial, right? It's not geographical only, right? Yeah, it does. They make a very clear point about this, right? I mean, they say it is not, you begin to see this in the section on that we did not, we're as usual behind, but not really, the primitive territorial thing, the notion, this is page 145, section 2 of part 3, the primitive territorial machine, the notion of territoriality, and I think we should, know this term, appears ambiguous, for if it is taken to mean a principle of residence or of geographic distribution, it is obvious that the primitive social machine is not territorial. Only the apparatus of the state will be territorial in this sense, because following Engels's formula, it subdivides not the people, but the territory, and substitutes a geographic organization for the organization of gens. And that's a reading of The Origin of the Family, Private Property in the State. I'm on page 145 in my text. It's section 2, the beginning of section 2 in part 2. Yeah, the primitive territorial machine. Okay, so, and substituted geographic organization for the organization of the gens. Yet even when kinship seems to predominate over the earth, it is not difficult to show the importance of local ties. This is because the primitive machine subdivides the people, but does so on an indivisible earth, where the connected, disjunctive, and conjunctive relations of each section are inscribed along with other relations. Thus, for example, the coexistence and or complementarity of the section chief and the guardian of the earth. When the division extends to the earth itself by virtue of an administration that is landed and residential, this cannot be regarded as a promotion of territoriality. On the contrary, it is rather the effect of the first great movement of deterritorialization. Interesting, huh? On the primitive communes, the immanent unity of the earth as the immobile motor gives way to a transcendent unity of an altogether different nature, the unity of the state. The full body is no longer that of the earth, it is the full body then of the despot, the unengendered, which now takes charge of the fertility of the soil, as well as the rain from the sky and the general appropriation of the productive forces. Hence, the savage, primitive socius was indeed the only territorial machine in the strict sense of this term. And the functioning of such a machine consists in the following: the declension of alliance that I mentioned and filiation, declining the lineages on the body of the earth before there is a state. So this is very interesting. Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, I mean, this is crucial. Yeah.
To go back to where you were, and again, just sort of like, an arist here and see where they come back. But when they're talking about like the two levels of flows, there's the deterritorialized,
the alliance and the filiation. Filiation first. Yeah.
Capital.
Okay.
Where we're talking about decoded money and decoded labor power. That there's sort of this dislodging of those aspects from the way they're embedded in tradition or ritual or exchange in pre-capitalist societies. I think that for Marx, and where the mediation is that in capitalism, labor has the function of producing money. So you actually have the question of how does the production of money take place under capitalism, and what are then the totality of the conditions that make that production possible? And so to me, again, like that gets back to the question of the mediating mechanisms. What are the mechanisms through which we have to reconstruct how these two flows, once they're constituted, in some sense presuppose and reproduce each other, right? So again, I just say that, you know, it will be interesting to see how that's how I see it, you know, as somebody who's interested in political.
Well, they're going to go to money, you know, in the later part of this section of this part, right, in the civilized machine, because money doesn't exist as money, you know, in terms of M prime or you know the CMC circuit until capitalism begins. So right now in this section, they're still in, you know, pre-capitalist formations.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to presuppose what we're reading here again is, I mean, or at least in the reading strategy, is to think of this as pre-capitalist, you know, formations that are being engaged, not the capitalist formation itself. Later, they will do this when they get to civilization, because, you know, the civilized, you know, machine, right, versus that of the despot and the barbarian, right? So in a way, yeah.
We'll just jump in. I was referring to what you were reading earlier on page 2.
Yeah. I went to that part just to go there too. Yes, that's right. This is later in the section. This is much later in this, right? This is the capitalist formation and beyond. Yeah, and surplus value is actually described pages 220. You know, really from 225 in my text. That would be the civilized capitalist machine, section 9. It's really devoted to Marx, the theories of money, decoded flows, etc. Yeah, this is where all that is happening, what you're interested in. You know, and the tendency, and I emphasize tendency of the falling rate of profit, not the falling rate of profit, as a lot of people talk about it, just like a lot of people say the Communist Manifesto. Nothing is further from the truth. It's the manifesto of the Communist Party. It's about a party formation. It's a manifesto towards a party formation against utopian socialists, against, you know, I mean, or at least in conversation, and a movement beyond. It has nothing to do with a manifesto about communism, right, ultimately, or the Communist Manifesto. So yes, Josefa, please. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Question. It's maybe related a little bit to what you were
talking
about. It's on the first page of the section 3.
Yep.
On page 139 in your edition, it says substituting for intrinsic code an axiomatic of abstract quantities in the form of money.
Yes.
So this, for instance, the passing from use value to exchange value, is that, I don't understand what the
Yeah, that could be. Well, axiomatics is in logic is a very different kind of logic. Axiomatics is used in capitalism all the time. That's the way it is. You know, show me the money. All of these are part of the axiomatic of capital. You know, and this is a kind of logic that we see, you know, the capital adheres to. Yeah, in many ways. So yeah. So that's what they're really trying to do. How you know, quality, you know, then is put back into axiomatic quantities, and they're looking at how this is operating, and then what are the rules that happen that way. So
that's why the emphasis on production.
Yes, absolutely. Yes.
So it's putting it to limits.
Right.
Is that what it's...
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, there have been some very good Marxist attempts, again, in the tradition. Sorry. Some very good attempts in the Marxist tradition to go through axiomatic logic and how capital works. One, of course, being Robert Blanchet, another Frenchman. I think some of it's been translated, but on axiomatic logic, he's one of the very best on axiomatics and logic and how it works. Because it deals with quantities always, the axiomatic. And this is what capital does. Capital is not interested in quality, it's interested in quantity. It's interested in the transformation of, quality into quantity in some ways, right? In a sense, right? Yeah. And yes, the whole thing about, we'll get into this more as we get further, because they know their marks. I'm not saying that they're the best marks. Please don't hear me this way, but again, they know their marks. So it's not like, they maybe even know their marks better than their Freud. Maybe we'll, see about that as you go forward. But again, this is about, as I mentioned, 2-3 sessions ago, it's a flow book. It's about flows, coding, decoding, territorialization, representation of territorialization and deterritorialization. If you can keep those kind of registers in mind as we go forward, and also see how these various syntheses are operating, I think you gain much more from the reading of the text, right? In many ways. And I like what they do with history. I think this is a very fertile way of looking at history. It's very much, Nietzsche is very interesting on history, the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical, right? He has the 3 versions of history and the advantages and disadvantages of history. Some people have translated as the use and abuse of history, but, literally closer to the German, it's the advantages and disadvantages of history. But, anyway, Deleuze and Guattari, I think they have a very good notion of, universal history is, going back to what Patrick was mentioning, is not only retrospective, it's also contingent, where we are, right, into the open future, if you will, singular, right, ironic, sometimes, you can put into that repetition, of course, and how, the irony of, the first time is tragedy, the second time is farce, as in Marx's 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, and then of course critical as a force in history. And critical for them may be also meaning, for Nietzsche, critical history was alacrity. You're not sitting on the antiquarian like the scholar, or the monumental, where you're kind of stuck in that, look at history as a history of not only monuments, but of the great men in history. But really the critical, which is being able to move, in a sense, right? Being able to be agile in your versions of history. So I think this is important. And another thing very important here too, if you think about the writing of the earth, right, and this relationship to the early relationships of the, I'll use the word again, savage, since that's the way the translator, but the wildness, or the earlier primitive culture, if you will, and the relationship to the earth, and then the despot, what comes up. And I don't know if any of you have read Ernst Kantakaros's The King's Two Bodies, but this is a very interesting attempt to look at the despot and the writing in history. He's a peripheral Frankfurt School member. Anyway, and then of course, the civilized machine and what it does with the earth, and it's rapacious capitalism, carboniferous and rapacious capitalism. This is what's going on. Civilized machine means rape. Yeah, really, in a sense. I mean, it's really, really horrible, but it's true. Yes, David, please. Yeah.
I was going back to think about Carl's question and how there was sort of a clinical application of this. And I'm not sure quite where this gets us, Michael, but if we think of someone I don't think they reference very much, Wilfred Bion.
Yeah.
One of his points was, in states of scarification that might cause extreme pain, that let's say you have someone clinically who's banging their head.
Right.
The person is aware of massive pain, which is a defense against an awareness of their suffering.
Right.
And because they're not aware of their suffering, they're blocking out a sense of history, what happened to them, how they got where they are, why where they are sucks, how they might understand that symbolically. And out of that, if they could stop headbanging and get out of that, they could then lead to some kind of personal change where they'd lead a more fulfilled life. The part that I don't know if it's their undertaking in this is there some way, if you really go into the socius, if you really got the flow going at the maximal channels, is there a way of shaking off oppression? Would you get rid of Marie Antoinette? Would you get rid of Donald Trump? Would you be able to make the Proud Boys healthier? Would they stop being a fascist organization? Would these various systems of repressive, cruel people realize they're fucked up and stop it?
Right,
Is
right.
there a pragmatic
I say
thing?
exterminate the fruits, to play on Joseph Conrad in
Uh-huh.
Heart of Darkness, exterminate the fruits. But I put it, opposite
Yeah.
how he
Uh,
used it with Mr. Kurtz. But anyway, yeah,
uh-huh.
yeah.
For them, is that part of their undertaking ultimately? That yes, the
I don't
brutes.
think there's a reformist notion here. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying, and again, bringing Bion into the conversation is very rich, and and trying to use this in clinical settings. I don't think there's a reformist movement here. I mean, at all. That you're going to be able to really reform the Proud Boys in a sense.
Right.
Yeah. But I mean,
But
it's interesting the way you point to that. I mean, they may, disagree and say, oh, yes, of course, we can turn this around and show, the desiring machine at work and, yeah. Anyway,
but there would be a way,
yeah,
for Bion as an inheritor of the death instinct and
right.
late Freud, who was taken over by Klein, who kind of begat Bion in a way, of saying partly with hurting yourself, with banging your head,
Right.
it's what he would call a form of negative K, which results in this kind of massive destructiveness that is emerging out of, I think, something they are really referencing in schizanalysis, which is in his system, the body is composed of this tremendous flood of beta elements, which are sensuous elements in the body
Right.
that may be unpleasant. Again, it's why it's hard to work with preverbal children. If you, say, are a pediatric oncologist and you're trying to explain to a 2-year-old that it's going to be throwing up for weeks because of a chemotherapy that's flooding its body, it's really hard because the child can't grasp that. Ideally, if there's the right dyadic involvement with a tender caregiver, the child would convert the beta element into an alpha element where there would be a moment of enlightenment. A classic story of this would be Helen Keller, where flooded with beta elements, deaf, dumb, blind, terrified, not knowing if it's 3 in the morning or 3 in the afternoon,
Right.
not knowing what's approaching her. In having Annie Sullivan as her tutor, she said this in her books and her speeches. She said, there was something about in being in such a deprived world and shocked into this world, where I had these capacities to see and hear, and suddenly they were just gone, and no one knew why, and my parents had fallen apart. She said there was something about just the rhythmicity of Annie Sullivan, the way she smelled good of soap, the way she gave me oatmeal, the way she stroked my face, where it was sensuous and reassuring,
Mhm.
so that at the moment when she put my hand into the stream of water coming from a fountain, I was receptive enough in that space to make a symbolic equation of the sensation of water flowing through your hand and her using my other hand to make the signs for water connected. There was a way out of my darkness. That
Right.
sensation in your hand really meant something, and symbol formation occurred.
Mhm.
Beta was converted to alpha successfully in
Mhm.
Bion's language. To go back to Deleuze and Guattari,
Right.
is there a moment where, when the flow is uninterrupted, the baby is sucking, the penis is ejaculating, the vagina is throbbing with joy, the bodies
Right.
are flowing in ways they organically would in an unrepressed way? I know they may not have this reformist tendency, but do they see that as having some capacity to awaken the subject out of a prison.
Yes. Yeah, no, it's a good point. Yeah. Very good point. I want to just go back to what you said about Helen Keller, just to make a reference. I'm sorry. Josepha knows this person, a local New Orleanian who lived in Covington, Louisiana. Walker Percy, the novelist, wrote a very beautiful piece in a book called The Message in the Bottle, How Helen Keller Came to See. And it's a very interesting attempt towards semiotic recognition, of water, sight, and touch, as you pointed out there, in many ways. So it's a very interesting thing, and also that the miracle worker done by William Gibson, his wife was an analyst with Eric Erickson at Austin Riggs Clinic, who wrote the major psychobiography of Waiting for Lefty Clifford Odets, right? So I just wanted to, there's very interesting things around Helen Keller. It's a very beautiful, beautiful story. And the way you presented it is wonderful about the sensuality that was involved in terms of being able to make that connection happen. And and going back to Deleuze and Guattari is that in some ways the neurotic, again to them, on the count, right? It's not a sensuous reawakening in a certain way, whereas the schizoid on the walk is much more sensuous, right? Or the Henry Miller with his ego loss, right? And when he one day just gives up everything and goes through this moment, right, of where he's, the lack of a better phrase, born again in the flux of everything, interconnected and all of this. So their literary examples are very interesting in this regard. And yeah. So I don't know if that's where you wanted to go, or what you're really speaking to, but I think there is this awakening, something that has been, in their view has been held down, has been repressed in some ways. Yeah.
David, what is alpha? I understood what you meant by beta, but when you talk about converting beta into alpha, what does that mean?
Alpha would be the symbol formation of saying that sensation is water. And that's really the alpha element, is saying the concept is now not an abstract, dry concept of someone who's never experienced water saying water exists. For beyond, it's more an alpha element says there's a contiguity or a synthetic connection between that physical experience and the word kind of coexist together. So I have the sensation, and I know whereof I speak, where I'm not talking in an abstract sense about, I've heard about this thing called water, and it's wet, and it flows, or like someone might think about sex in a way that says, I've heard it's a really wonderful, weird experience that people have, but is able to say sex with a more embodied awareness of saying, I have felt orgasmic sensations or streaming, so I know what that is, and the word is really full and containing it, as a way of saying I'm not just sort of using a word that I don't know what it means, but I really fully understand it from the world of my body. Which is why, if we look at a point Michael was making, I think 2 sessions ago, about hysterics, the problem Freud identified in them was the aridness and the vapidity of their language, where the hysterical patient is what we would call desymbolizing or highly concrete, because this patient will say, I went to the bus stop, I got on the bus driver was wearing a blue hat, I sat next to someone, they were chewing gum, I then got off the bus, I came to your office, I sat down. There's no, what the French would call la langue here, of someone saying, I got on the bus driver really revolted me because he reminded me of my father. The gut hanging out over the belt reminded me of the way my father grossed me out because at the dinner table he passed gas and he was fat and he made me feel like he was dominating the family, which made me sick, and that's why I'm here.
He was driving the bus too. He was in charge.
Driving the bus of the family, so he was
on top of everything else. Right.
That kind of language, why it's so boring, and Michael's being funny about it, but it's so true, is in its dullness, it is pervasively functioning to block any degree of connectivity just in that way, Michael was able to say, the power of Lalande was to say, and bus drivers drive buses in my family. He was driving the bus of my family. And I could think metaphorically with symbol formation to say, Jesus Christ, I don't need any more men in my life who are these fucking bus drivers. Let me out. Help. I
In
see what
my
I'm up
case, in Washington, they don't know who's driving the bus. In my case, that's the way I look at the bus. Nobody
I,
knows whose hands on the wheel here.
I had just another question, David. So how would you, to relate this back to Deleuze and Guattari and their notion of coding, or the kind of, the connective disjunctive syntheses, how would you relate that to what you're talking about in terms of the movement from beta to alpha? Are they completely separate worlds?
I think that that's why I was curious to see if they had any awareness of beyond. My sense from what I'm reading of them, and my knowledge is quite limited there, it really is that they don't see it that way. I think they see it more in a Marxist, only Marxist standpoint of saying the coding somehow is a ritual that gives membership into something that allows the person to feel like they're part of a socius. But I don't see them as really seeing it as blocking a psychological process when I think it does. And I'm curious to see more of them, but I think that may be a part of their work that has a limitation in terms of
Right,
the way psychoanalysis functions, actually.
right.
I don't know that they
It doesn't perform the blocking function, which you think is still important in terms of how the coding works.
I do. I think that there is an element of it, it seems to me, from a clinical point of view, that's not being addressed about how that functions. So a lot of times borderline patients do cut and scarify, and often if they stop doing it, there's more of an awareness of them trying to seek out power in other ways other than the usual dynamic there, which says, I'm in pain, but I don't understand it. And so cutting myself gives me a momentary relief of it, which may in modern psychiatry be aided and abetted by a transient burst in serotonin and other neurotransmitters that do create an ecstasy with cutting. But usually people who do that say, but I felt happier because for once I was in control of this. I cut myself. No one abused me, I did it, so I could control it. And two, because I controlled it, for a moment I had the illusion of saying, my mind blocked out things I couldn't understand because at that moment the only thing that felt real was the pain of that. And so if my parents abused me in various ways or I was hurt in various ways, I'm really not thinking about those things the way the hysteric, Freud described it as la belle indifférence, was kind of looking at their paralysis with happiness because there was a way of saying two things. One, I don't have to think about the unconscious history that got me here. And two, for a moment, I have a weird kind of relief because the whole problem is the fact I can't move my leg. If that's the only problem, then I guess I'm okay, rather than thinking of the huge psychological miseries that actually might be behind this if my symptom gets solved.
Mhm.
I mean, we all know clinically it's tough. Not everyone can go through an analysis because you tend not to feel better in a lot of the phases of going through an analysis
A little
because you're
more
letting
everyday misery, yeah.
yes, but you're also letting go of the containing systems
Yes.
that let you cope, although they're neurotic and are also blocking things, they're maintaining a kind of homeostasis. My question, as someone who doesn't know Deleuze and Guattari well, is to see, but it seems like the feeling is they're not so much about a transformative revolution that comes out of the awareness of consciousness rising, an awareness of history coming through to the proletariat in a way that it was for Marx the prelude to a revolution.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. The proletarian is no longer the exterminating angel of capital, right?
It's
Uh,
Right.
interesting.
I mean, which is interesting that they, in a way, I don't know, some of you may know the work of Andre Gortz, but farewell to the proletariat, farewell to the working class, right? Was sort of the movement in France and in the Euro moment in the 70s and early 80s and really, nobody really talks about proletariat anymore as an agent of history. We talk about, Amazon workers should unionize and all of this, but this is very watered down compared to union struggles as before, I mean, or labor capital struggles, that
Well, one thing I was, what you were saying, David. I mean, to me, I guess this gets back in a certain way to my earlier concern about this, and maybe this is, influenced by a former teacher I had, Richard Lichtman, who
yeah,
tried to, sort of negotiate this terrain of, the social and the psychological.
Sure.
And I don't know that he was ultimately successful, but it seems to me kind of what you're getting at is how are these social mechanisms or social systems reproduced and inscribed within the psychic operation, which then would have all these complex features, right? I mean, that's kind of what I've gotten from reading Freud, is that there's all these mediations, there's condensations, there's symbolic displacements, there's all these things that are going on, right?
Yeah.
And then you need to decode them but then understand sort of again the mediation. And I think that's always been kind of the holy grail of this Marx Freud symptom.
Well, you're very Hegelian, Carl. They're not. So anyway, it's okay. I mean,
well, but it's not so much from Hegel as it's more from, I think, my understanding of of Marx. It's more of a Marxian, his theory of mediation and his theory of
I mean, I think what they're looking for is this materialist psychiatry that ultimately will understand what you just presented. How is it this social repression is translated into psychic repression, and what then is the, give and take on that, and how does one understand that?
Again,
unfortunately, as we know, it always comes down to, as David was saying, 10 years of analysis and you feel worse or whatever, or, it's not everybody, obviously, but, it does happen, and, people hold on, internally and et cetera. And, so again, there's a real care, if you will, operative in this book to kind of, let's move on, let's do something different and create those kind of, capacities, if you will, a new kind of labor capacity for psychiatry and psychoanalysis, right? Moving forward. I think that's one of the attempts here, certainly from Guattari's point of view. Yeah, because he continues his practice and et cetera, and he's really militant in the world. He's not someone that's just sitting outside, of all of this and just critiquing. He's active, in it, and it is a practice. And just going back to Bion is actually mentioned by Deleuze and Guattari on the early pages. On page 19, Bion is the first to have stressed the importance of the I feel. So they're aware of, of Beyond. Yeah, this is in the early section. This is on intensities becoming the subject and enjoyment, right? And exactly what you were saying, David, you and Felix would have a great conversation about this and be very much in agreement, on the retrieval of the sensuality. The first to have stressed the importance of the I field, but he places it in the realm of fantasy and makes it an affective parallel of the I think. And they're reading the elements of psychoanalysis, right? So again, it's not fully endorsing them, but certainly very aware of this I feel. Yeah. It's a footnote. It's about, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fifth paragraph, the footnote on the fifth, at the end of the fifth paragraph on page 19 of the section 2 of the first chapter.
Which I guess brings us to this other question about
sure.
Which is, again, they say only fantasy.
Right.
But it's interesting that Guattari was a practicing analyst, in that it feels again they don't see fantasy itself as powerful. When
he does. Yeah,
he does. Okay,
he does.
So,
I'll send. I'll bring next week some texts to you.
Okay.
Yeah. So very, very, very active in terms of and going back to what Carl said. How do they implement this? He studied actively through group psychotherapy and group institutional practice, group fantasies.
Right.
Very active. And wrote about this. Yeah.
The first chapter.
Very, very much. Yeah.
He talks about group fantasy, and that's that really struck me because it seems that that's where they locate the potential to de-reify social institutions, to reinvest them as, a field of desire that can be reconstructed and transformed. But it's very much at the level of a collective agency.
Yes.
And,
Yes.
yeah, very much. It's not at the level of the individual on the couch undergoing personal transformation. That
Gotcha.
valuable. But yeah.
I mean, very much, David, I mean, I guess in some ways, and I don't know if this still goes on so much, but the milieu therapy, in terms of where you have group rounds and group fantasies are discussed, early in the morning at the end of the day, and this was the kind of thing of the open psychiatric institutions. And remember, Mary Barnes is their case in some ways. This is a very active case in a way. It was not so successful, but in a way, Mary Barnes was an interesting case study, of that period. I think it's in the molecular, I've seen it in multiple places, but I think he has a section in this book on molecular evolution, I'm just trying to see, this would be, I'll find it. I think it's Mary Barnes or Oedipus and Anti-Psychiatry, right?
Okay.
And he has 9, it's about a 3,000 word, little short essay on the case of Mary Barnes, I'm sorry, at Tavistock in the 60s. By the way, he has a section on money in the analytic exchange too. Yeah, he's very, there's a kind of really radical notion. Money functions as a misleading equivalent in the sense that the value that it represents or crystallizes depends on the position one occupies in the production system. Yep. To those wielding power in a system based on the extraction of a surplus value, money means something quite different from what it means by those selling their labor. It crystallizes both a way of organizing exploitation and a system for disguising the class struggle. And then it determines not only people's structural positions within production, but also the nature of the production encoded in the system. And he has very interesting things to talk about, the contact. And again, he'll use this language of recoding often, how capitalism recodes, right? What is estimate what money represents in the analytic exchange, or rather pseudo exchange, where there's no real exchange of services between analyst and analyson. There are 2 sorts of work involved: the analytic work of the patient and the psychoanalytics work of listening and sifting. It is actually quite wrong for there to be any flow of money from one to the other. It is in a different social system which viewed these 2 sorts of work in the same way as another form of production. The analyst and the analyson should both be paid, right? So maybe the state should pay the Proud Boys to go see David, right? And pay David to treat the Proud Boys, all right? So there we go. Just as the social division of labor dictates that not should only factory work be paid, but work in offices and research laboratories as well. So he's smart, he's clever, he's got a good sense of this, in a way. I mean, the analyson, the patient, if you will, is undergoing enormous work, if they're really into it. I mean, David knows better than us, and, there's some that come in who are really willing to, undergo real processes. That's really hard work. I mean, it can be all day long. You lose a lot of nights of sleep, you lose, et cetera, et cetera. So why not have the state pay, right? In a way, why not have the state pay, the analyson to go under? But for, bring the Proud Boys in, bring the, the Klan in, whatever, et cetera. These sheets you wear, let's talk about these sheets, et cetera, right? I mean, so I think there's a lot to be said here that they thought he is thought through. Guattari, Deleuze never. I think Deleuze was trained as an analyst, but didn't. I think he maybe practiced a little bit, but mostly a writer and teacher of philosophy. But Guattari practiced, I think, until the very end, in his way. So he was always thinking about what these things meant. Right. And it just wasn't like, do you take Medicare? Do you have insurance for this? Or, is your family from the Upper East Side, Fifth Avenue and to Madison? Oh, you're on Second Avenue. I don't think psychoanalysis is for you. You mean you were on Second and 91st instead of Fifth and 91st? No, I don't know if you should be here. Right. Anyway. Yeah. So yeah,
I like Guattari's. I think he brings I'm drawn to him in the sense that he is rooted in the practice, and yeah, I like that. Anyway, I've got to get off.
Yeah. No, we're way over tonight. It's okay. Thank you again, and this was as usual very good. All the interventions, and thank you, Beryl, for bringing up Durkheim. Durkheim is very present, not mentioned at all. I'm going to have to go back and pick up elementary forms of religious life and read that alongside some of the anthropologists they cite. So yeah, so thank you, everybody. See you next week. I'll put some stuff in the document this week. Definitely, I have some time to do that. So yeah. So anyway, so see you next week. Thank you. Okay. Bye.